Ladies and gentlemen, I have the complete delight to be here with Owen today, who wrote this magnificent book, Defensology. His Substack, YouTube, Owen in the Agnon, is brilliant. The scholarship there is tremendous. The books that he reads and studies are not usually read and studied, which is really unfortunate because they're full of genius. And they're also full of ideas that can, famously Hume said, Kant said that Hume shook him out of his dogmatic slumber. Well, I think the text that Owen is focused on, indeed, can shake us out of our dogmatic slumber of maybe a kind of dogmatic progressivism or a problematic capitalism or neoliberalism or problematic university education that kind of basically says, we figured it all out. All you need to do is plug up to the program and you're good to go. And if it doesn't work, that's your problem, right? There's something about thought, or much of the thought of the zeitgeist today, that feels frozen. It feels stiff. But of course, if it also sets the horizon of thinking, and it is that very thinking that has created the stiffness, it's very hard to shake out of it, seeing that it's the cause of it. But Owen's scholarship is an example of the work that actually provides the resources to shake us out of our frozenness, our petrification, our inability to think beyond. I talk all the time about Nash equilibrium in situations where rationality or technological essence, or however you want to put it, in its brilliance leads us to problems, not in its deficiency, but in its very rationality leads to suboptimal results. So, are we doomed? Well, if you check out Owen's work, you realize we're not. We just have to think differently and read books we don't normally think and think thoughts we don't normally think. And we have to do so not just with the mind, but the whole body and the whole self, and resist temptations of domestication, which is a lovely phrase that comes up in this book with Sloterdijk, the animals and others. So, Owen, if I were to ask you, what do you mean by defensology? And what are you hoping to do with this book? What would you say, Owen?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask about the title, but you did. Yeah, the title is kind of playful. I wouldn't put the meaning of the book too much in the title.
Nice.
I like to just play around with words. So that's defense, obviously defense. So there's a theme of defense and how a society or an individual soul, we could even say, in a kind of metaphysical sense, defends itself. Um, and the subtitle is human aggressivity and the civilizing principle. So maybe that might be a bit more helpful for people to kind of get a foot in the door. It's kind of I suppose, a philosophical. I've so writing the book was difficult, but writing a blurb or describing the book is even harder. So, but I suppose it's kind of a philosophical, psychological slash phenomenological study of human aggressivity. And I say human because I do think, in some sense, that human aggressivity is unique. It doesn't operate on the same principles as like other animals, for example. There's similarities, of course, but a bit like how psychoanalysis might talk about sexuality in the same regard. It doesn't really operate on the basis that animal instinct does, even though obviously we're still animals and biological in some sense too. But anyway, the way in which human aggressivity is civilized and, I suppose, controlled, managed, directed, contained, framed, theoretically framed, morally framed, and so on and so forth. There's a bit of a reading of Plato, which I suppose is the basis of the book, in which I talk about how Plato's kind of larger philosophical project and philosophy itself and thinking itself is sort of inseparable from what you might call a kind of dialectic or a tension between cooperative human impulses and whatever psychologies and dispositions, and more aggressive, more high-spirited, more thymotic sort of impulses and dispositions. So there's a tension in the dialectic between those two, which you see in Plato. It doesn't get talked about very much. It really doesn't get talked about very much, this specific aspect of Plato. So I kind of zone in on that, and I expand from there, and I just go into all these different areas. I go into kind of various different areas, kind of a bit of a Nietzschean critique, I suppose. If you were to put me on a spectrum of what sort of Platonist I am, I'd probably say I'm a little bit of a Nietzschean Platonist. To some people, that won't make any sense, but I try reconcile that a little bit. So yeah, and I just go into all these different various areas, kind of a little bit of a critique of like too much of an emphasis on like tolerance, the idea that we can just evolve ourselves out of this aspect of our psyche. How that aggressivity is turned in on itself. So I have one section all about kind of the repressivity, kind of Freudian repressivity of civilization, and how maybe we can, if we're going to be repressive, which means auto-aggressive, basically what that means in some sense, at least in my kind of framework. How do we turn that into something that's valuable instead of just merely degrading us, humiliating us, and so forth? There's also a kind of mythological inquiry into Prometheus and so on that we can also go into. It's various different areas, but that's basically kind of where it originates from, and then I try to expand from there. So we'll start from there. Yeah.
No, I think that's magnificent. Well, first off, I think it's an asset for a book not to be summarizable in its title, because there are far too many books that you know what it's about by reading the title, and that's the problem, right? I think also, like you were saying with defensology, I think we live in a society that doesn't think about defense. We think about solving, we think about figuring out, we think about consuming, but the idea, like we've talked before about, I like to associate philosophy with self-defense, because there are ideas that are trying to capture you. There are things that people just say that if you don't have a self-defense against, then you end up spending the next 2 weeks with that thought in your head, unable to escape it, right? Like you need that self-defense. Also, too, there is always the possibility that you need to think a thought that you've never thought you need to think, or that you end up thinking a thought that you misunderstand that can screw up your entire life, right? And if you don't have defense systems against various ideas, notably autonomous rationality or the logos, I know in the way you were talking about Clausewitz on the idea that there are different logi, right? Different rationalities, and the rationality on the battlefield is very different than the rationality in the math classroom, right? So obvious when you say that way, but how many of us go about our days practically living as if there is no difference between those two things, right? I like to always point out, people say, just because there's a technical difference between those things doesn't actually that actually can benefit ideology. Because if there's a technical difference between rationality in the classroom or thinking on the war site, the fact that that difference can convince you that you live that difference. But actually, the more real is what you practically do. And we do live in a society that practically lives as if the only kind of thinking you need is technical, is the technique, the solving, right? Not the live situation. I love what you were saying on Clausewitz on this idea that you literally can't plan the battle ahead of time. You have to live think the situation. What was the phrase you used? That there's a way in which the concrete breaks your abstract ideals, right? You have to respond to the enemy. You have to respond to the situation. Oh, it was a great plan, but it's raining. Oh, great. And we're out of food. Oh, great, right? There's a certain active thinking. And what's so interesting about that is I really do think we live in an age that basically treats thinking that cannot plan itself ahead of time as not real thinking, right? Like if it was real thinking, you're able to predict the future. We conflate thinking and prediction, right? But on the battle zone, there's always a limitation to prediction, right? There's always a limit to how much you can predict. With Ivan Illich, I also like to talk about the difference between plan and prepare, right? We associate a smart person with someone who can plan the future. Your 5-year plan, right? When really, Ivan Illich, to defend us from the disablement of the technological essence, he says, well, actually, you want to think about being prepared, right? Are you prepared for what happens in 5 years? Because if you're prepared for it, it doesn't really matter what happens because you're ready for it. And actually, funny enough, planning can make you fragile because you're not prepared for your plan to fail, right? Now, that doesn't mean planning is bad. Planning is inevitable because you have to go, you have to make a plan to go to the grocery store. But if all you do is plan, and you never put thinking in the area of preparation, which I would associate military thinking with preparation, I would associate thymos with preparation, and of course, defensology with preparation, well, then there's something that makes you very fragile. And there's actually this is what's crazy, there's an entire realm of thinking that you actually have never thought. And yet you find yourself so smart You find yourself so rational and educated because you can come up with these plans. And yet we know that humans are terrible at predicting the future. We see that every financial crisis, right? Every election. Like freaking like like if you want to make a bet that the experts are wrong. That's a really good, like obvious bet at this point, right? Under complexity. And so under all of this paradigm that we're under, to think in terms of, am I ready for the unpredictable future? Am I prepared for challenge? Am I prepared for facing a threat? Am I able to mount a defense against the unexpected and the unknown? That way of thinking is so absent today, that yeah, all we can do is domesticate ourselves. All we can do is kind of shield ourselves from the society. I'll throw it back at you. I'd be curious if anything comes up for you.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think maybe something we could make a kind of division here is like technical intelligence and situational
Yeah.
intelligence. And I think you're describing the situational, and I think that's something about more kind of traditional military thinking that like Clausewitz, for example, is a good example of this because he'll say exactly that you can have your abstract theories, but as soon as the actual battle happens, the concrete world will obliterate those abstractions. Certainly not something that like after COVID, I think a lot of people are like, wow, we really are caught in abstractions. So like, we can expand this away from like just it doesn't have to just be battle or war, which today we don't even know what war or battle is anymore, actually, which is just one of the points like of the book, I suppose. Although the book isn't, it's not designed to be like a theory of war or like a history of anything specifically military. But because I'm expanding from that Platonic soul at the very beginning, it includes that, and we know that from the Republic, the Guardian class and so forth are this peculiar class of people that are some kind of educators, governors, and soldiers at the very same time. And it's very strange for us in the modern world to conceive of these connections. But yeah, I think situational intelligence is what I think maybe would be a good way of framing that. And I think just in terms of modern military thinking, I think what's happened is security has kind of taken over from that classical understanding of defense. Like defense is a kind of national defense is a kind of classical term. And I suppose what I'm trying to do a little bit here too, other than kind of look into the psychology and phenomenology, is also kind of repoliticize these things a bit. I think, when you have security and technical experts keeping us secure with surveillance and drones and, kind of strategic intelligence, not that you don't need strategic intelligence, but kind of complete neglect of all the other kind of ethical, political, phenomenological, metaphysical even aspects to this. I think you end up clearly with a very dysfunctional you end up with a dysfunctional like ruling class, but you end up with a dysfunctional culture as well, because I think what happens maybe is that we misunderstand things, and then we might expect people to just be completely tolerant the whole time or something like this, or maybe we kind of attack masculinity and say masculinity is toxic. You see all the kind of secondary and tertiary symptoms of this problem. Like, I don't have to go into all details. People probably are aware of this stuff themselves at this point, but yeah, so yeah, I'll throw it back to you.
No, I think that's brilliantly put. Well, I was thinking, because you make the point also how there's a way in which we've kind of replaced, after the nuclear bomb, right? There's kind of the idea that the threat of nukes mean we don't have to worry about war anymore. Now that's changing, but that was kind of the idea. And it's very interesting because although we talk about national defense, it's really not been defense that we've done. It's been threat. It's more like we'll all die. And threat and defense are not the same thing, right? Especially the threat of a technological apocalypse or a nuclear bomb seems like you have a national defense, but actually in its extremity, it actually removes the incentive to have to think about strategy, defense, how to arm yourself, how to have self-defense, right? Because I can just blow you up. Oh, you attack me, I'll hit this button, we all die, right? And so it's interesting how there's actually been a kind of, because of the nuclear bomb, you could say, a sort of separation between threat and defense. That's now kind of coming back to the forefront. And you see, when you have threat that does that, then it creates an environment where it practically seems as if you are thinking defense, and the logi that you have that's just the technological thinking is all you need, because even though it's not, the environment has created a certain insulation that practically makes it the case that it's all you need. But the problem is it comes with these pathologies, because the violence thing goes what? Internally. I think, a lot of people talk about domestic abuse, domestic violence, and different things. Well, what's very interesting is you really have this idea that if you don't take seriously themos, as I'll put it, if you don't take seriously aggression, it doesn't go away. It just goes internally, it ends up repressed, and then it blows up, right? I am also, we've been having a few conversations at the net, and Michelle and I, on anger. Like, what is anger? And I'm very interested in the phenomenology of anger, not just merely the how do you cope with anger, but the experience of anger, right? There's a lot of interesting things. Without going too much into it, I am increasingly convinced that the same energy that is on display in anger is just the same energy of human motivation in general. Like that energy, because when you're angry, you get motivated. There's suddenly a burst, right? Also, too, you get something feels like in your social life, it shatters, right? Like you tend to get angry when there's something external from you that's broke, right? It's not merely like when you make a mistake, you may go, dang it, Daniel, but it's not really that heightened anger. It almost always has a certain social kind of meaning that's going on in anger. There's also something with anger where it seems almost like daydreaming. Like you just find yourself angry very suddenly. Like daydreaming, you just find yourself dreaming. Anger is very sudden. Bitterness and hatred seem more brooding, right? But anger, which can lead to those, has this very suddenness to it, right? And the very fact that it can come so quickly and bam, you're hitting someone, or you're hitting your wife, or you're in domestic violence, or you're screaming at someone, or you're angry at all men, like this just rage that just comes out of nowhere, suggests that that right there is something you cannot solve away, only be prepared for. Well, we don't have a culture that thinks preparation. We have a culture that thinks threat. So what does everyone do? We just create threats, right? Threats against men, threats against households, threats against nation, threats against everyone. We have no preparation to work with the appearance of this aggression, to actually work with it. And here's the point, I'll give it back to you. If anger is in fact drive in a real sense, or the energy of drive, if we can't learn to live with anger, then you're going to get domesticated, nihilistic, meaning crisis, unmotivated people, right? Because you can't get one without the other. And something I think that came out in your book that's so good is basically because you have this idea of the threat of the nuclear bomb, you just have not had to think aggression. I think basically also what we did is we're like, well, if people don't learn to deal with their aggression, if nations don't learn to, because I just consider that all on the same gradient, you basically go, they're going to have to get rid of it because otherwise it will kill us all, so they'll have to figure it out. Well, what we learn in friggin' Socrates and Plato is you can't get rid of thymos. Like, it's not something that goes away. It's always there, and if it's not there, the human is dead. So you basically learn to manage it, or you deny it, and if you deny it, then you get a dysfunctional human being, perhaps in a domestic violence, or just by people being so unalive, so unmotivated, so like confused or anxious or mentally ill. Like these are all manifestations of a culture, in my opinion, that doesn't take seriously human aggression and anger, because all of those things to me seem to be libidinal. They are the energy of human motivation itself. And so if you can't think it, you're in huge trouble. I'd be curious any thoughts that come up for you.
Yeah, good. I want to pick up on the point of insulation, but maybe we'll do that next round because I wanted to pick up on the phenomena of anger you're talking about there. So one of the things I kind of suggest in the book is, well, actually, I don't really, actually, Peter Sloterdijk's book, Rage and Time, which was extremely motivational for me in this, in writing this, which I totally recommend people do it. I have to give credit where it's due. He kind of makes this point that, like, for example, psychoanalysis created a very sophisticated system of thinking about sexuality and libido, but it didn't do the same thing with anger and thymos. And I think that project needs to be done. Like, I think it's really clear the project needs to be done. If you look at somewhere like, just take what's going on in the Middle East right now, you can't look at that and go, oh yeah, let's let's just pretend that we're all going to be peaceful kind of consumers, or we're going to get more and more rational forever and ever. It's just like, it's just that sort of, I suppose, post-war, as they call it, post-war, which was part of the whole, global liberal hegemony. Was a part. We were all going to eventually sort of, I don't know, evolve or civilize ourselves completely out of any sort of kind of intolerant, aggressive uh, motivations or drives, and I think that's just not going to happen. So therefore, we're going to need to think about this stuff more in a more sophisticated sense, because as you said yourself, it's not going away. Just a few points also on the using the phenomenon of anger and what it's geared towards and so on. Like it's difficult. There's so many different areas you could go into here. Like for one, there's memory, right? But like look, Hamlet, right? His whole retaliation against his uncle started with the father saying, "Don't forget me." Memory, like it's I don't know if you've seen the Northman, this film that was made
Oh
like
yeah.
about two
Oh,
three
that's
years
good.
ago.
Yeah, yeah.
Fantastic
That's a
film.
good movie.
Really, really captured what we're talking about. Like super recommend. If you're gonna make like a film list for this subject, that would be at least top three. And this sort of, I think Slatter like does talk about this in his Rage and Time, that anger can operate not just for an individual, but for a people, and he goes into a lot of detail. He does like readings of the Old Testament, for example, and he'll show you how like actually a sort of almost like a destiny of vengeance even can it ignites the human soul in some sense, and as you were saying, it motivates it and so forth. Now, obviously, that can lead to bad things, but we can't deny its existence and can't deny its, in some sense, its legitimacy, because if it's just part of what we are, then if we're just going to completely deny a part of ourselves, then that's going to be bad too. Um, Hobbes. Now we can get into a small critique of Hobbes, because Hobbes said anger is hope. But then he's like, and it's also the worst thing, and it has to be stopped, or else we're going to go civil war. And Hobbes famously didn't want the Iliad to be translated into English. He didn't want young Englishmen reading the Iliad, even though he actually translated copies himself because he knew Greek. So I don't know what he was at, but anyway, don't ask. Hobbes was an extremely peculiar man, very intelligent but a very strange man. And there's a critique of Hobbes which is going on in this book, which is that I think that the it's complicated, but basically I think that the main task of civilization is a certain kind of, I would say, rational repression of, or maybe not even repression, but a kind of monopolization of that instinct to a sovereign, so that everyone else is kind of living without it. It's completely outsourced. It's the equivalent to sort of like a haram, like a sexual haram, basically. Like,
Yeah.
it's like the sexuality is only within a kind of monopolized thing at the top, and I think this structure of the modern nation state then is also something that could be critiqued. I don't go into that too much in the book. It's implicitly there. And there's no reason to think also that anger is purely some sort of latent kind of animal instinct or something like that. Or a purely irrational force. It's
Exactly.
part of a thinking too. I mean, we don't get angry about some things, we get angry about other things, and like when we get angry, we do so often through our
Mhm.
conceptual frameworks of fairness, justice, equality, legitimacy, blah 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 blah. Right. So we're thinking this emotion is always geared through certain frameworks of that are essentially kind of philosophical forms in some sense. Also moral norms like legitimacy and so forth. If you were to be delegitimized in some sense, or you were to have your authority taken away from you in your work or in your family, whatever, where like our reaction towards that is not like, like my biological instinct is acting up. No, there's that, but there's also a conceptual framework by which you're understanding that offense or disrespect or attacks and so on and so forth. Yeah. So
No, brilliant. I mean, well, I really agree, and I think that's brilliant with Sloterdijk on this kind of point on psychoanalysis, giving us a very robust understanding of sexuality, but not anger, and that there's something about anger that needs to be done. I strongly agree because there's something about anger. If psychoanalysis, looking at like a Lacan, for example, is really interested in desire being about a lost object, like desire forms when you don't have something that you want, and actually, if you get it, desire is doesn't want it anymore. It then moves on to the next. So you're on this hamster wheel, right? There's some sort of denial of the object that creates desire. Well, is there not a certain denial of the object or denial of anger? That's why you're mad. So there's something about anger that seems to be like desire, but actually it's forced to confront temporally. It's like a squishing of the temporality. Like desire, the object is far away, where in anger it's squished, and the encountering of the denial of the object comes too quick, and it's denied to you in front of you, and you can kind of experience being it gone versus getting it and then not wanting it anymore, right? Like there's a denial and a want that comes together, and the denial of the want also feels unfounded or unjustified, right? Whereas what's interesting with desire, when you get the object and you lose desire for it, it's kind of more like, it's not that you feel like what has occurred is unjustified. It's like, oh, I just don't want it anymore. You don't feel an injustice. You just feel a change, right? And you desire the next thing and the next thing. Whereas with anger, there's a denial of something, just like in desire, but it feels unjustified, and the desire is still there, but it is thwarted. So there's something profoundly psychoanalytical about anger that seems to be like desire, but there's something different in how it's brought together, and it seems to be a breaking of the social order or socialization versus what Lacan and many of the other people talk about is that the very function of capital or capitalism or however of society, the way society works as civilization and its discontents and all that Freudian stuff, the way that it does it is by creating a hamster wheel of desire as such, right? Because if desire can never go away, because there's no object that fulfills the desire, then if you create the correct economic system, you have infinite productivity. Because everyone trying to get their object will never get it. Well, then they're infinitely productive. And all you have to do is never, ever break the plausible deniability that the object will not bring them fulfillment, right? If you can keep them believing that the object is obtainable in a manner that is fulfilling, well, then theoretically your economic system can go on forever, right? That's why psychoanalysis, like through Zizek and all these people, can actually help us understand like the functionality of capital, at least in a modern sense. Now, of course, as we've talked about before, depends on what capitalism you're talking about. You have your Dietrich McCloskey, you have your et cetera, right? However, what's very interesting is it's almost like anger, and this is a reason why I appreciate your subject material in your book, is because there is something about anger that can be a kind of revelation of the proper way that desire is supposed to work, that in its breaking of the social order, precisely in the realization of the mechanism of the denial of the object, that in itself may open a space to think of the movement to what Lacan would call drive, really. Like a movement to drive, which is motivation that's not based on getting an object, but your own internal motivation, your own intrinsic motivation. Because if you're capable of suddenly just having motivation of this incredible intensity, not to get the object, but in the denial of the object, well then, hey, maybe it's possible to have motivation without an object entirely. Instead, maybe an art form or a process or something you want to become. Right? Anger unveils the possibility of the human to be incredibly motivated in a powerful way without there being an object dangling in front of them, without there being a carrot dangled in front of them. But one of the reasons we don't tend to notice that is because anger is bad. Anger is like, you're not supposed to do that. Like it's evil, right? Well, to be very, not that I'm saying there's literally a conspiracy for this, but like if anger actually unveils the possibility of a powerful human motivation outside the logic of economics, which is based on the lost object of desire, it literally is a threat to the social order in terms of productivity, because it shows the possibility of a human being passionate about not an object. They can be passionate in its absence, right? And you could say, well, that's still toward the object because of the loss of it. Doesn't, but that's the first step. It's the beginning of this, because you also mentioned in your book the underthought concept of sublimation, right? Like sublimation is a kind of it's a concept that's there, but it's tricky because the sublimation is overly, and I agree with it. I think it's very much focused in sex, in desire, and how to sublimate it. It seems to actually have more to do with coming to terms with this revelation of anger and aggression. Like if it's like, wait a minute, I could be motivated by that of which is outside the range of a carrot being dangled in front of me, right? That seems like it has to be the grounds of sublation, but we haven't thought that. And it just brings back, and then I'll give it to you. Any thoughts? It's like you have this wonderful line where you said, Plato understood the same faculty of mind, thymos, which is the psychoethical grounding for martial virtues, is also the regulatory force which deals with insatiable appetite, right? The reason I bring this in is because drive, everything we just said is that drive stops desire, right? Like the insatiable desire that's going on forever. Drive is precisely where you're motivated not by appetite, but you're motivated by some internal resource that appears in the denial of the object if we could only learn to sublate it, if we could only learn what, well, your book is teaching. And so it's fascinating to me that because it is, and I do think there's a kind of mystery in a lot of psychoanalytical writing of how you move from desire to drive. There's a sense of its importance. There's a sense of that's the only way ultimately to deal with the problem of desire. Otherwise, the denial of your object, the denial of your desire becomes something you find liaisons in. You like enjoy, like masochism. You come to enjoy your denial, and you get all these kind of gymnastics that the brain does to come to terms with its denial. And you could even kind of link up some psychoanalysis with Girard and different things like that, with masochism and all that. But there is a kind of like mystery. How in the world do we sublimate desire into drive? And I think it is in freaking anger. It is in aggression. It is looking at this particular experience more so than sexuality, more so than desire. Now, don't get me wrong. Anger doesn't exist without desire, nor does like it all goes together, right? Like the only reason you use your brain is because you care. Like logos is even tied to like desire, right? So it's all connected. Well, it's almost like what Plato and Socrates were saying is that they all go together, but never mind. But a more refined analysis on the phenomenology of anger, because every talk I have to mention phenomenology at least 5 times. It's really important to get that on your bingo card. But that seems to be the way to think the problem of desire to drive, at least from a new angle that can then complement the libido and the sexuality. But the anger and the aggression seem so important here. And it does seem distinct. I think the point you made where we say, oh, that's just animal instincts. Is sex animal instincts? That doesn't even get close. Like, literally, are we going to find, like, Zupancho will describe, like, some dogs? I don't think what is sex needs to be written to describe what dogs do, right? What is sex by Zupancho or Lacan needs to be written for what humans do in sex, right? So it goes with anger, right? Yes, there is something animalistic about anger, but that's just because humans are partly animal, but you can't reduce it to that. There is, in my opinion, a much more robust account needed for anger and aggression. But let me throw it at you.
Yeah, that was great. I think maybe the thing I was thinking there when you were describing that was negativity, like the point at which that desire cannot be fulfilled, but you keep going anyway. I'm a little bit reluctant to kind of go into like a death drive framing of that. I think that's a little bit. I know Zizek has this idea of like the hamster, was it the cartoon animal that runs off the cliff and he keeps running even, which is a really good analogy. And I think that's different than the Freud, because I think, as far as I'm aware, Freud's death drive was more in that kind of Buddhist self-obliteration sort of thing. I'm not an expert on this, so
sure.
People in the comment section can correct me if they want. But there is a kind of negativity here which you're describing, and I think that this negativity, as you were saying, is not being fully appreciated in what it is. For one, is kind of ontology, almost like what it is, how it affects us, and what value it can have in civilization. Because we seem to be in a situation where we don't know what value has civilization, and we want to get rid of it, because if it is not controlled, or it's like, this sort of absurd thing, it's like, give it money, give it pleasure, give it sex, give it this, give it that, it's not happy, what's wrong with it, why won't it be happy? And it's like, well, maybe we just have to learn to live with it, but also think about what it is. And interestingly, this is really a key issue for the whole end of history question, because history is very much driven by this negativity. And a kind of, again, something which Sloterdijk points out in his book Rage and Time is that without this negativity of sorts, like we are uncreative. Like we don't have a kind of will to a future. I would say hauntology and lack of imagination, and not having kids and stuff could even be related to this, which is very counterintuitive because you'd think that would be the opposite. It's like a positive thing, but you know, there's something very paradoxical happens when this negativity sort of doesn't know how to express itself, doesn't have a way of expressing itself. It's not. We're sort of being civilized out of it in some sense, and it's, you know, the institutions don't provide a space for it, and so on and so on. To sound like Zizek, so on and so on and so on. You know, you kind of meet a crisis here, and we're in the middle of that crisis now. Fukuyama points this out in the last few chapters of The End of History, which are one of the best things I've read. The last section of The End of History is fantastic. And he talks about Nietzsche, you know, and Nietzsche obviously understood this to an extreme degree. And you know, the Übermensch is basically an incorporation of that negativity back into ourselves, you know. And what was I going to say? Yeah, Fukuyama, he kind of says there's a crisis because liberalism was successful insofar that it was able to sublimate that what he kind of calls he'll call it a kind of thymotic ambition. We can call it whatever, it's many different terms, but this thymotic ambition into various things like business and sports. He says that what liberalism does to control it is it actually, like, liberalism doesn't necessarily control things by like directly controlling it. It redirects things. So it redirects it into, at least this is, maybe things are getting different nowadays, but it used to do this. It redirects it into away from religion, away from politics, and away from the military. And it directs it into science. It directs it into business, and it directs it into entrepreneurship, and it directs it into these kind of secular institutions that are more friendly to liberalism, capitalism, so on and so on. And the point basically here is that the question is can those expressions of negativity function? Can they actually turn that negativity into something which doesn't destroy the society, but at the same time offers an outlet for it, and so on? And I think I have my skepticism about this. See, this is the thing. I'm a bit this is one of the reasons I'm not just like a liberal, because I have my serious skepticisms whether or not, even like a Hegelian liberal, which is in my opinion the better version of liberalism. But you know, it's you know, I'm not sure it can. I think, and Trump, something I point out in the book is that Trump is a good example of this because he was an entrepreneur, he was a billionaire guy, and he wasn't happy. So he got into politics. He got into politics. He went where he's not supposed to go. And the crisis which that created within the whole Western society now is obviously, you know, it's more of a crisis than just like Trump is doing this or doing that or blah 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 blah. Because in my opinion, actually, on a very practical level, he's not particularly astute or threatening politician, but he's just the fact that you have a kind of, I think, a kind of psychopolitical. He's kind of crossed the Rubicon in terms of psychopolitics. He's kind of gone in. He's supposed to just be a businessman and a celebrity. His ambition is supposed to stay there, but he's gone into this other area, and that's back in history kind of thing. And I don't mean to like make Trump sound more interesting than he is, because I'm actually not on board that he is this big threat to society. I think he's actually a much more controllable, boring man than everyone makes out. He's just a media craving narcissist, basically. But anyway, but the point is, liberals think, oh no, you know, he's going into this area, and there's a reason that it has a kind of a trigger response for them. And I think it's because of this. I think it's because of the history of liberalism, the way it's basically psychopolitically coordinated off this negativity from military politics and religion. And I think that once those lines are crossed, their society is going to react to that, you know. So I do want to talk about the insulation thing, but I'll throw it back to you first.
No, it's brilliant. You know, a few things. First off, I think it's a little ridiculous to compare Trump and Hitler. in the sense of I think Trump is definitely far more motivated by a certain failure of the fulfillment of neoliberalism, which is a loaded phrase. I sometimes don't like using neoliberalism, but at the same time, it is a term that meaningfully refers to the Washington Consensus, right? But if you catch my drift, there's a motivation of it wasn't enough. Whereas Hitler, you can't say Hitler was motivated by like freaking neoliberalism. It was there's much more scheming, much more of a sense of the needing the needing to rise up out of the ashes of losing World War I and all sorts of other things, right? Like you can't the psychoanalytical motivations between those individuals, I think, are clearly different, of course. Now, that doesn't mean Trump can't do some stupid stuff or some major problems, but I think we are, well, actually, I think the very fact that we compare Hitler and Trump right there shows our inability to think of human motivation outside the horizon of the end of history as described by Fukuyama, right? Like it's hard for us to understand different frames of human motivation, right? Because like the idea of Trump being motivated by the failures of fulfillment of, fame and success. No, they don't fail. Those are the things that are going to deal with all our problem, right? So that interpretation is, we mostly have to say he's a bad man. Oh, and who else is a bad man? Hitler. Okay, so that's what ends up happening. We don't have a good understanding of motivation within bigger frameworks and zeitgeist of human motivation. I mean, the other example to it is all these celebrity scandals. Unbelievable numbers of celebrity scandals. We need to make those people evil, because otherwise we'd have to say that the theory of fulfillment that is put forth by neoliberalism is false. That's almost more traumatic, and socially it is more traumatic than simply saying those people are evil, right? And that's kind of a Nietzschean point, right? Like we need to other the revelations of the incompleteness of our system, because then otherwise we would have to rethink the system, right? So let's not do that. Let's just other these people who have a lot of money and fame and yet are doing these terrible things or then running for president. Well, it's because they're corrupt. It's because they're evil, right? Well, actually, maybe they're just reaching the top of the mountain of neoliberalism and finding a freaking swamp, just like kind of Ayn Rand said about Marilyn Monroe or something like that, right? You get to the top of the mountain and you find a swamp, right? Or something of the soul is not fulfilled. And I think basically the issue is we can't figure out how to move desire to drive. And actually, to your point on death drive, I think the key to death drive is, I would say that death drive comes to define the majority of people, if we take it as this kind of drive of death, under neoliberalism, because they can't think of something beyond it, right? Like, I think there's something very true. Like, what you see in kind of, like, the death drive idea, basically, is the idea that you're so much driven by the desire to the fulfillment of the object that it leads to a certain self-destruction that you actually come to enjoy, and you're driven by that very destruction and that movement toward death, which is the trying to get an object that can never fulfill you, right? And some people shorthand it and say we have a desire to return to the womb. I think that's what the oceanic and different things, and that we're confusing the oceanic with the object. I think that is kind of getting at something. There is this idea of the human being no longer being stressed by the anxiety of desire. But where Lacan comes in and Zizek as well, is basically saying, well, actually, we come to enjoy the very denial of the object itself. It almost moves from a desire to get to the oceanic. We come to enjoy not getting what we want. We come to enjoy the death drive. We come to enjoy you could almost call it sometimes an unsustainable drive, like that of which is not sustainable. Because let's put it this way. If indeed there is something about neoliberalism that can never under any circumstance fully humanize the human being in its current form, then to be motivated by neoliberalism is a quote-unquote death drive, right? Not because you are consciously seeking your own death, but because of its framing of what is the human being ultimately is going to be, the other term I use is self-effacing. It's going to actually be effacing of what it is the human being, yet one is engaging in it precisely because they think it is that which will make them more human, right? And here would be my point. In a society where we have no ability to think aggression or the movement to drive or the stuff that's being put forth in your book, death drive seems to be a pretty good strategy. Like, what else are we going to do? See, let's be driven by liaisons. Let's be driven by death, because that seems to be the best option at this point, right? And you see, this is where, like you mentioned, Fukuyama, Fukuyama is often kind of beat up, and, obviously we can critique him all day, but there's something tragic. It's not like a celebratory, like, yay. It's more like, well, there are no other options on the table. Hope this works. Let's see if it does. And basically, I think Fukuyama, he certainly has sounded this way, in my opinion, in more recent talks. He's like, okay, yeah, but what else we got? What else we got? It's not like a celebratory. It's like, okay, it doesn't look like business and, I think you put it very well. Science, business, and entrepreneurship doesn't seem to address thymos. There's some evidence it's not working, but what else we got? And so what ends up happening, too, is that I think the death drive, which is indeed, I think, an accurate description of most human motivation under a first world nation. It does actually come into those tunes. It's not fundamental. It doesn't have to be fundamental. Even if it describes 99.9% of people, it doesn't have to. Because it is theoretically possible, if we could figure out the movement from desire to drive, to instead having desire find drive in death drive, which is what it does when it gives up on any other possible source of drive, which it becomes its own self-turning wheel in that death drive. What if we were to, I don't know, think aggression and anger and try to sublimate desire into drive by thinking libido in terms of aggression versus eros, right? That's it's like they talk about first of all are weird people, all the psychology and so all of those studies are worthless because they're based on Western people who are weird and not like the rest of the world, right? It's a true description, but it's also weird, right? There's so many sociology, psycho studies that are not repeatable outside a first world context, right? I think death drive might be like that. I think it might be an accurate description of weird people, but it doesn't have to be the description of all human beings throughout all of history. But we face it now because we've hit the limits of what, over-indexing, eros and logos can do. And now you're at the point where you have to rethink thymos. We can't even think it, so death drive. That's it. That's the limit. So learn to enjoy your death drive. When it doesn't have to be. It's kind of like, again, and then I'll throw it at you. It's kind of like, for me, Girard, when you talk about memetics. I think memetics is an extremely accurate description of 99.9% of people. But I think we were talking with the great Sam Willman at the Net on the idea of joint attention. You literally couldn't learn language if all you had was memetics. You also need joint attention, meaning multiple people have shared attention of the same object it's not trying to take it, but it's actually a joint attention that creates the communal bond because we're all focused in a joint attention on the same thing. Joint attention requires high trust society, social, communal capital, families, all that stuff, right? Well, if all that's been destroyed under neoliberalism, because like you say, it moves towards science, business, away from religion, then you're not going to have joint attention. And what the counterfeit of joint attention is memetics. Because if I can't share attention with you, all I can do is mimic you. It looks like joint attention, but really I'm just mimicking you, right? Well, this creates the effect that mimics is how humans are always motivated, when really it is a highly likely accurate description of, say, 90% of people under neoliberalism, where they're not able to think joint attention because they haven't dealt with the thymotic to have joint attention. And joint attention, of course, we can associate with what? Military activities. You sure as heck better have joint attention with the soldiers and other people, or you're in huge trouble, right? So there's something about joint attention and thymos, and then, of course, recognition that all goes together. Because another way to put it, where there's a lack of social recognition, you're going to hate that guy. So you're not going to have joint attention. He doesn't recognize you, so you can't have joint attention. So where recognition is lost, you get memetics. And then where you get memetics, you get, that is when you could use Girard's theory as a very accurate description, because once you have memetics, how do you deal with it? Scapegoat, you kill them, sacred violence, so on and so forth, right? But just like death drive, memetics tends to describe what people are like, especially in the West, who are not able to think the problem of aggression. right? So if we want to, well, not end up in a world where we kill one another because we don't have a sacred violence anymore, or we don't want to end up just liaisons of death drive, then the phenomenology of anger for me is so frickin' central. Because right there, you are seeing the possibility of the human to act in of themselves, to themselves, as a high quality. There's something that, boom, arises. And actually, I do think, and then I'll give it to you, I do think it's funny because many people who end up like climbing great heights or doing great things who don't then end up pathological are ones that tend to have a kind of, I'll show you, like a certain vengeance actually motivates them. They're not, they want to be like, screw you, buddy. I'm going to do this. I think a lot of people who've been screwed by the universities are over here in the liminal web going, screw you, buddies. Okay, you think? All right, fine. Actually, that's a kind of nobility of vengeance, right? And it's actually where vengeance is used in a kind of empowering way. There's a certain empowering that happens with vengeance. But then I think going to the Hamlet example, whereas you do have an honoring of Thymos, the problem with Hamlet is he has a memory of his father dressed like Apollo in a Christian society, so he can't logos balance. This is where there's a problem of logos, because there's two conflicting value systems that he's in the middle of. He's driven rightly by justice and honor and Thymos, but then he doesn't know the correct system of ethics to think through, right? And this is where I would have to go into that. But I think that also, though, shows where you have to have all three, right? You have to have all of those things together. And if you can do that, then going through anger and really, really thinking anger and aggression might be a way to have a desire that moves to drive sublimatively. That is not simply the death drive because we don't see any other alternative or any other possibility. But let me throw it at you.
Okay, yeah, that was really good. I think you hit the nail on the head with the joint attention thing. I think exactly. Look at military and then look at religion.
Yes.
The same thing. It's joint. It's not only joint attention, but it's joint attention with a high sense of self-sacrifice involved as well.
Exactly.
Like you're supposed to not suffer for the sake of suffering necessarily, but like you're supposed to be willing to make sacrifices for a larger cause. There's a kind of metaphysics of transcendental, or at least in a more secular sense, something like a nation or something like this, by which everyone's kind of umbrellaed under, and they're drawn, motivated towards a similar thing with a similar set of values. And it often does have a transcendental element to it, even if it is secularized. To be honest with you, I think most of the time it does, or at least a sense of destiny, like a sense of national destiny, or something like this. There's always something going on there. So you get rid of this and you have this liberal society in which all those energies are sublimated into these kind of more atomizing capitalistic mechanisms. And then, as you're saying, and then there's nothing to bind us together, so we go for mimesis. And that's exactly what happens. And I think you're right there with even something I think about with the death drive is like, without this kind of, without a way to express this force, this energy, however we want to put it, through joint attention, you end up with things like terrorism as well. I think that's kind of death drive expression. And I think what we often do, as you were kind of indicating there, was we take something epiphenomenal and then we go, oh, that's a universal principle of human existence. Like, no, it's not. It's an epiphenomenal thing to the destruction of religion, and also probably, for the sake of this conversation as well, I would say military duty. Like I'm as critical as an ex-person when it comes to like someone going to tell me, NATO's going to tell me to go fight the Russians. I'm going to tell them to piss off. But it's not about the specific thing here or there. It's about the fact that there's kind of anthropology of a set of basically men who get together and say, we're all sacrificing ourselves, potentially risking our lives for some sort of larger understanding of some sort of a good, basically, right? And then of course liberalism comes and deconstructs that and says, well, that will only lead to civil war and blah 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 blah. Then you have this response to that, which is, you were saying, this sort of mimetic structure and this kind of death drive structure. And I think it's exactly I think that's like a perfect theoretical explanation for a lot of this stuff. So we've just come up with a great explanation right here. So that's great. And oh yeah, the universities. Just a comment on that. I won't go on a big rant about it, but one thing I do notice, speaking of this kind of negativity and creativity, I've noticed that like a lot of young people, particularly young men, who they're like, well, I'm not gonna play the game with university and like, just not be honest or not publish anything I really think or not have a kind of, not just. And I think like the boomers and the Gen Xers, even to some extent, um, uh, were able to sort of play the game, and then like within enough time, they were able to publish some better things, and they were able to play the system a little bit. Gen Xers a bit less so, but still to some extent. And then the millennials and the Zoomers are, of course, I mean, well, the millennials as well when it comes to academia, can't do that. So like, well, the interesting thing that's happening actually is that you got like younger people, particularly younger men, who are like, well, I'm not going to play the game. And then you've got like people publishing interesting books and like at a younger age as well. So you've actually got like this weird phenomena of like I'm 31, like, and it's like I can't believe I read a book when I was 30. Like I just like what the if you told me I was going to do that when I was 15 years old, I'm like, you're kidding me. Like, uh, and then part of it is just because I'm like, well, I'm not going to play the academic game in like 20 years for try write this book. And when I write it when I'm 50, it's not going to be the same book I'm going to write when I'm 30, is
Yeah.
it? You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
not going to have that same energy to it
Right.
because I do think that, you know, I'm not saying that a 50-year-old and a 30-year-old couldn't come up with a similar paradigm or a similar theoretical argument, but it's going to have a kind of different expression, different energy. And I do think that's an important thing that's happening now is that creativity is actually expressing itself because it's no longer being captured by, oh, well, in 20 years, why don't you publish that? It's like, that's not going to be the same book when in 20 years. Anyway,
No.
uh, that's another thing. Um, yeah. Okay, I'll throw it back to you, but I do want to just touch on because there's another aspect to the book which is interesting, which is that so I think we've kind of dealt with the more Hegelian recognition aspect and the kind of way in which individual ambitions can sort of drive at something and come together, negativity and so on.
Yeah.
There's also this other aspect to defensology which sort of explains a little bit why I called it that, which is that if you look at a lot of these origin myths and origin
Yeah.
stories, you see this structure which I'm sort of fascinated by, and it's relevant to the whole notes on the pod thing
Yeah.
and the way we use technology today, which is that there seems to be, I kind of have this idea that there's a tension between exposure and insulation or something like this,
Mm.
something which exposes, something which covers up, roughly speaking. And um, this is sort of seen axiomatic, I think, to a kind of consciousness. And this is kind of where I try to really posit my own theory about things. A consciousness of extermination, basically extinction. And if you look at these kind of founding myths, especially the way Plato plays around with them, with Prometheus
Yeah.
and so forth, you do see there's one text in I think it's Protagoras, and Protagoras is laying out this origin story myth, and it's interesting because he doesn't say everything was terrible and then we made civilization. What he says is a bit more Rousseauian. He says that everything was great. There was this perfect thing. It was abundance, no conflict. Was it abundance, no like Rousseau's state of nature sort of thing. And then God was managing over us humans, kind of like an Adam and Eve sort of situation. And then all of a sudden, God's protection, because this is something I want to get into perhaps in the next book, is kind of the kind of metaphysics of protection as well, and like how that protection went away. He doesn't say
Yeah.
why it went away; it just went away. Um, and uh, and then all of a sudden there's conflict, there's scarcity, there's all the things which politics has to deal with, basically, right? And and there's a description in it where he says wild beasts then tore us apart. We were like naked and shoeless.
Yeah.
Kind of reminds me a little bit of the original sin myth. You suddenly realize you're naked, and then this feeling of kind of harmony and pleasantness suddenly goes away, and there's shame and there's negativity basically intrudes upon. And I kind of think that maybe there's some sort of like there's a kind of original state of consciousness by which we have a sort of memory of, by which sort of the interruption of that. I mean, you could analogize this to like being born or something. You're in this
Yep.
womb, it's a perfect state, and then all of a sudden, you're exposed to things, scarcity, conflict, negativity, blah blah blah. And that's really something I think which a lot of our civilization building, you know, deals with. It kind of is driven by that fear of original the possibility of for being kind of exterminated,
Yeah.
and the way in which various technologies and like legal systems and everything can come about as a result of that is interesting to me, because I think that it's strange when I went, especially going through the COVID crisis, I was kind of thinking like we are really driven by this kind of primordial fear that we're going to be just obliterated. And like there's actually not really much of a rational explanation for this, because as you know, I won't go into too much, but like,
Yeah.
they didn't seem like the threat was being described accurate to the actual physical object. It
Yeah.
seemed like there was a distortion of that threat. And then you think about the way people today sometimes, and I think you said insulation earlier, and that's a good word I like to think of being over insulated. And this is a pathology I think of civilization and of domestication, that we're
Yes.
sort of we become unable to actually identify the kind of magnitude of threats and so forth, because we're sort of being so it's almost like civilization has responded to some sort of primordial fear, but then in that response has distorted our capacity to sort of understand things which are overcome or understand the
Yeah.
things which are threatening. So there's a sort of distortive aspect to civilization, which I think also I was trying to kind of hint at in this book as well. So I'll throw it back to you there.
No, magnificent. I mean, when you talk about Prometheus and that story, where humans, were not given any claws or fur, and actually their strength came from their nakedness and vulnerability. That's extremely powerful stuff. And from the book, you said, Prometheus, of course, steps in. So humans, his brother's going around giving stuff to the animals, and he's like, "Oh crap, ran out of claws or stuff for the humans." And then it's like
Mm.
Prometheus, of course, steps in to gift humans fire. So that's an idea. And by so doing lays out the potential for an ontological empowerment which far exceeds the largest, fastest, and strongest of the zoological rivals. But the key that you point out is we kind of skip the initial forgetfulness, nakedness, and exposure to the risk of being torn apart and overwhelmed that lays the groundwork for such heights, right? The vulnerability is an essential detail. And you also point out in Notes to the Plot on the idea that, lightly armored men, if you go onto the battlefield super armored, there's a lack of thymos there, right? Like one goes onto the battlefield rightly and fittingly armored, but more armor it may look, more thymotic, but it's actually like a loss of the thymos, right? Because what armor is a way to make up for a lack of preparedness. Armor makes up for a lack of skill or ability, right? And so there's an idea that it is only because humans are actually so naked and vulnerable that they are capable of actually using fire in ontological height, right? Like that is the ontological precondition, right? I think that's extremely important because, there's a lot of talk, and it comes up like there's the idea of risk. We don't take risks anymore. What is the desire to avoid risk, but the desire to avoid vulnerability, right? And there is this idea in the system that you have to take risk to create value, but maybe the word risk hides us from what that word really is. There has to be vulnerability to create value, right? Oh, well, we don't want to think that. We want to just think like risk, which at this point simply means algorithm to get around the risk. Risk is now a computer term, unfortunately, right? We plug it into the system, we get it around. So we've lost the word risk as meaning vulnerable. So now we're in real trouble, right? Because it does seem to be vulnerability that brings us out. And then, of course, Ivan Illich, and you brought it up, famously and beautifully says, in a world where pain is curable, it's unbearable, right? In a world where pain is uncurable, we can bear it, right? Well, that's weird until you understand that uncurable pain is a constant realization that we're vulnerable, that we're human, which, funny enough, actually motivates us to rise to its occasion. But if pain is curable, it's unbearable until it's cured. I have to run to the expert. I have to run to the doctor. I have to put on the fig leaf. I have to put on the armor, right? So funny enough, it is pain that is uncurable that actually becomes more bearable because it unveils to you your vulnerability, which funny enough actually unveils to you your power. That's the weird thing, right? I actually think it is tied to anger because when you take anger seriously, you go, oh my gosh, I'm vulnerable to getting angry at any moment. At any moment, I just find myself mad out of nowhere. It doesn't even feel conscious. I just find like it's a daydreaming. To me, this is fascinating because it actually says that there's something in you that you're kind of vulnerable to. That is a revelation that actually that is the revelation of having this potential of a drive that's an alternative to the death drive. And another way to think of death drive, which again, I think how Lacan and Zizek and Freud and all of them are describing it is extremely accurate in a first world nation for the average. And even Freud himself basically said psychoanalysis was for first world nations, not really for second and third world nations. And I think that's very important because then death drive, but in a way, death drive is copium. It's how you cope. Okay, neoliberalism doesn't actually fulfill the human being, so, well, then we'll just cope with it by making a drive out of that which is self-destructive and self-defense. It's copium, in a way. It's how you just keep going. But it's probably not optimal, right? And so there's something about vulnerability and actually acknowledging your own vulnerability to your body, to your emotions, to these thoughts, that actually is the key to unlocking ontological empowerment, right? But if you treat anger as something you shouldn't have, well, then it's curable. And basically, curable emotions are unbearable too. Like, that's the weird thing, is a curable pain is unbearable. Well, actually, curable thoughts and curable emotions are unbearable. That's why you have the pharmaceutical, you have medicine for every emotion, you should therapy for everything, and left. It's the therapeutic culture of Philip Reeve, because curable emotions are unbearable, actually. And then, ironically, by removing those emotions from our thinking, which I think emotions and thymos tend to go together more than like logos or different things, because we also, emotions, I think, are more on the side of the thematic than even the eros, because eros is more on the consumption and the desire. Of course, there is an emotional, but the revelation and truth of emotions is found in thinking of it more thymotically. And what emotions unveil to you is a certain vulnerability that, if you rightly approach, actually empowers you. But we can't think that because, in a sense, we've underplayed emotions in some psychoanalytical thinking, not all, in favor of desire. And we think of emotions as that of which come out of desire and respond to desires and are shaped by desires, which of course is true. But actually, the trick to sublimating desire into drive is to, in a sense, switch the order and like really acknowledge the primacy of motion before the desire versus simply emotion in reaction to desire. Likewise, you start going, wait, desire and its failure can be a negation sublation, to use a Hegelian term, into drive. If we prioritize the vulnerability that we have to our own emotions and these kind of motivations that come out of nowhere, and learn to harness them, learn to channel them, right? Because again, when people talk about a meaning crisis and all of that, to me, that's a motivation crisis, right? Like, you just can't motivate yourself. No, you can't motivate yourself, because motivation is something you're vulnerable to. Motivation is something that comes. You channel motivation. You don't will it. You don't say, I want to be motivated today. I want to, like you were talking, like it's like, it's a lot of you were talking to the great Samuel Barnes about this with cold showers, optimization, rigid lifestyle. What is that but like willing drive, like willing motivation and different things? Now, don't get me wrong. I was a wrestler and long distance runner. I'm all about cold showers. I get it. But there's a certain limit to what that kind of technocratic thinking can do, because actually it will only work to the degree where it is creating an atmosphere and place for you to encounter your vulnerability to this thing inside of you that you need to channel, that you need to figure out how to let come through you as drive, right? And that kind of mindset of being more of a steward of ourselves than an engineer of ourselves, like we're more so a space of an unfolding than we are like a machine. We're more like a garden. Yes, there's some planning, but there's a lot of stuff out of your control. It's more like a stewardship, man. I was speaking with Dave and Mikey about it. It's more of a stewardship kind of model that we need to think the human, right? Of something unfolding. And I like that because also stewardship is almost always outdoors. It's always like something you do in a field. It's not insulated. It's not in walls, right? It's like outside. Engineering is at your computer. Like planning is at your computer, right? But stewarding, you got to go outside with your hoe, work the soil, ground it. Like, so there's something about the stewardship architect, like agricultural language. Now, of course, we have a, that's from my bias, but I think it's just truer. The human being is more like something you steward than it is something you engineer. right? There's like a plant called your emotions growing inside of you, and you need to do the habits and disciplines to be a better garden of yourself, but it's not really something you engineer. But when we overly think of, oh, I need to make a better plan, I need to better engineer, that metaphoric structure of thinking the human being goes in the direction of domestication and insulation, because you do that at your computer. You do all of these things within a gym, inside. I also am extremely interested by just the idea of being in a house to the point of joint attention, because what you mostly see in a house are what? Walls. Bam, your line of sight is hitting something, right? When you're outside with like imagine if you were hunting an animal outside, your line of sight is very wide. And there's a very good chance that lines of sight can encounter one another or that you share objects, right? The language of joint attention makes a whole lot more sense outside. Inside, you're mostly seeing a barrier. Like sight doesn't go very far. Sight inside doesn't go very far. Sight outside can go very far, right? But this is also important because inside, if we are trained by sight subconsciously, then we mostly think of things we desire as seeable and close and objects we can see. If you live mostly outside, you'd be seeing a whole lot of horizon. And what is the thing that humans, I don't know about you, at least me, when I'm outside, I want to go to the thing in the distance. Like, I don't want to go, I can see that. I want to go far. I want to go there, right? But when you're in a house, you tend to desire what's in front of you, object there, right? There's something about outside that screams drive too, because you're suddenly actually driven and motivated by something that your line of sight sees and yet is beyond the line of sight, right? That's the weird thing about being like a horizon is weird because you do see the horizon, but in another sense you don't, right? Like you see something that is beyond your sight. That's actually the characteristic of drive versus desire. Drive wants something that is beyond the something wanted. So it doesn't fall into the lost object problem, right? Like when you're driven, drive is more like a drive for a horizon, whereas desire tends to be for a cookie. Desire is an object, therefore inside walls. To live in a house is to live in an environment habituating you to think objects, furniture, and desire. To live outside is to constantly be toward and motivated to horizons or mountains or things in the distance. Here's the key. When you see a mountain in the distance, you know that's challenging. Because you have to walk there and climb it. It like screams to you challenge, right? In your very sight of it. And even though you see it, it's actually denied to you unless you rise to its occasion. When I see a cookie in a house, it is not denied to me and it is not a challenge. Here's the funny thing. What is the only thing that could keep me from the cookie? My parents saying you can't have it. It's authoritarian. The only way to have a denial of desire in a domestic setting tends to be authority, tends to be law-based, right? Yeah. And so we get trained neurotically, to use Lacanian, like power authoritarianly to relate to desire. Whereas outside, it's not that your father comes up and says you can't climb the mountain. He might, because it's more that the mountain itself says, try me. Like that is so the only way you climb the mountain is drive. Whereas most of the time you don't get your desire because someone says you can't have it, right? Well, that breaks joint attention right there. That also creates a submissive relationship. And also you're trained to think of desires as stuff you have to earn. But there's a big difference between earning the money for a cookie and training yourself to climb a mountain. Under capitalism, we conflate earning, which is basically working, with having the physical capacity to climb a mountain, right? Desire is given to you on the hamster wheel. Climbing the mountain is given to you by training. Seems similar, but actually is a very different quality of work, right? And basically, we are just habituated because also too, like you can have joint attention on the mountain. The three of you is like, we're going to go there. So the team has joint attention on the mountain. If there's a cookie and the three siblings want the cookie, someone has to not get the cookie, or there has to be a fight because only one person can eat the cookie. Objects, almost by definition, are zero sum, whereas horizons are non-zero sum. Everyone can win together, right? Where in terms of human motivation. But here's the problem. Horizons have to be thymotic. Like they have to be. Like you can't logos or eros a mountain. You can thymos a mountain, dang it. And joint attention can come out. And you also have, here's the other key to that. If you climb, and then I'll give it back to you. Climbing a mountain is a kind of, and it's in a way like a death drive. You're like working really hard climbing the mountain. You're like risking death. A way to put it is that where we don't have a culture that risks death, we have a death drive, right? Like if we're not willing to do risky things that like work yourself to death and work out and different things, like drive has a certain death quality to it, but the drive of, you know, working hard and risking death of climbing a mountain is different from the death drive of trying to be motivated by a desire that's never fulfilled, so you come to enjoy that denial that eventually leads to a kind of empty life, right? A certain self-effacement, right? So it's very interesting that I just, like when you talk about the animals or Sloterdijk or the inside of the pod, there is something about the experience of inside that I think favors the mistake of desire over drive and mimetics and all those other things. Whereas when you're outside, your very experience tends to be horizon, drive, mountain. There's no authority saying you can't have it. The thing itself is a challenge, right? It's not arbitrary. A mountain is, in being a mountain, hard to climb. A cookie is not hard to eat. The only reason you don't get it is because your parents say you can't have it. So there's a power relation there, right? And then, of course, the thing is, a mountain, if you don't respect the mountain, it kills you. But that's not because it's arbitrary power and can put you in jail. It's because it's an effing mountain. Whereas you can respect the police or something, or the military, because they can kill you or put you in jail, right? The monopoly on violence, right? So then it's very difficult to get healthy hierarchies in a society that doesn't have mountains, because most of your experience of hierarchies have this kind of arbitrary feeling to them, right? So then we get confused about power. So then we're just saying all power is bad, right? Anything that seems to be a hierarchy or masculine or power is bad, right? Well, that makes sense. In an incubated, domesticated society where the high majority of power is not a mountain saying, I'm hard to climb, but someone saying you can't have a cookie yet. That's the dominant experience of power in a domesticated first world society. So then, of course, you just generally come to associate power with arbitrary and keeping you from the stuff you want, because you don't have a regular experience of a mountain saying, try me, that in its very mountainness is hard to climb, right? So the separation from nature, I think, greatly figures into these mistakes. And then, of course, it does seem like, and then I'll give it to you, if you don't have joint attention plus this notion of the aggressive and the thymotic, you can have these perverted joint attentions like the terrorism or the joint attention from the brotherhood of fighting the system. It seems like you need both. You need this understanding of drive plus joint attention, because if you get joint attention that is motivated by the death drive, then it's joint attention to just do, that might be the mob. You know, that might be the, you know, the mob of people who are burning things down. Yeah, there's joint attention, but it's in the name of a death drive. We need drive plus joint attention. That seems to be when you get these true social transformations, like you see in the military, like you see in a wrestling match, like you see in these different things. And, you know, climbing a mountain would be an example of drive plus joint attention in a healthy way. But let me throw it at you.
Yeah. No, yeah, you've basically perfectly touched upon what my conclusions started to be at the end of the book, which was a kind of spatiality of thinking as well, like a kind of anthropology and spatiality, like thinking inside, thinking outside, thinking in different situations, coming back to the situational awareness. And I like your idea about walls. I've just realized that is like the big thing that's in front of you when you're inside, and it's amazing because it's how much of human history did we not have that? How much history did you had like a small hut,
Yes.
maybe like a farmhouse, maybe, and like most of the time you're outside and like you just went in there to sleep and eat,
Yes.
basically. You know, even in the winter. I mean, you might have a hearth and you know, and it's like we're just in these big cities or these towns. Even small towns have this. When the COVID crisis happened, I just saw this because I'm from, like, I wouldn't say small, but medium-sized, kind of semi-rural place in Ireland, and I just saw like all these like wealthier people coming from Dublin because they wanted a view of the ocean, because where I grew up is next to the ocean, you know, and they want the view of the ocean, they want the screen, you know what I mean, the big double triple glazed window, extra heating, smart home heating, you know. They want to look out at the ocean. They don't want to really be in it. And it's funny because the town I grew up in, it's a big swimming town, so everyone goes swimming on Christmas Day and in the ocean, like it's freezing cold. And there's a kind of sense of being in the ocean, not just staring at it. And then you have these stupid tourists coming in and just looking at it, you know. But anyway, this is my provincial reactionariness coming out now. But but there's like a there's a that and even in a city, uh, you see other people's walls all the time. Like, you know, you see like your neighbor's walls, the walls of this building, that building. I have no idea what's in any of these buildings. I walk by them every day. Yeah, it's a lot of walls. And there is something completely different about that. And I also like the point you made about the when the sort of environment doesn't give you the challenge, we may create the kind of authoritarian thing. I think it's exactly like also a good explanation to how kind of urbanization can actually affect us. Urbanization can give us a kind of authoritarian disposition because it sort of removes that challenge, it removes
Yes.
that adventure, you know. And Jung is interesting here too because I think Carl Jung, you know, I think he really dealt with motivation probably most out of all the psychoanalysts, and you know the whole hero's journey, you know, and he's sort of interpreting this now. I'm sort of, you know, we talked about Reef before, like last year, or it was last year or 2 years ago now. It was a long time ago. No, whatever it was like a year and a half. But he talked about, you know, how Reef kind of criticizes Jung for being too like applying these myths just to kind of like lots of individuals kind of have your individual myth, and it's kind of it loses its shared attention that you're talking about. But there is something about Jung kind of coming in and saying, you know, our sort of meaning has to have a kind of like long journey to it. It's not just like short, like cookie and this and that. The sort of the sort of anthropology you're talking about of the inside, and you have everything's ergonomic. I wrote that in the book.
Yeah.
Ergonomic, our thinking, and ergonomic is a term that came about because people were designing kitchens. This is very domesticated, and and people were designing kitchens, and they wanted like the dishwasher to be beside the oven, so they didn't have to walk too much from one place to the other, and blah 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 blah. And you're kind of like, okay, I mean, like it makes sense in that very sort of like stupid rational mind, but at the same time, it's like, um, you know, it reminds me of that line in Fight Club where he's like, everything's prepackaged, everything's easy and prepackaged. And he's like, when we fly to space, it's gonna be the corporations that name all these like cities that we land on the moon, which reminds me of Musk, you know, it's we're gonna go to the moon or whatever, and Musk is gonna create like, you know,
Rosa
Bitcoin.
City.
He's gonna create like Bitcoin Nation or something on the fucking moon. which is exactly what he's gonna do. Yeah, but yeah, I know. Yeah, like it's this sort of convenience, you know. It's this convenience, and of course, the thing about the moon is, I understand, I understand maybe the motivation, kind of, but like, it's like, what are you gonna do when you get in the moon? Are you just gonna like sit in a space station? Can you walk around outside? Can you do anything? I mean, like, it's not really. Can
Hey
talk on the
mom.
phone.
Hey
Yeah, I'm on
mom.
the moon.
Well, we just text. It doesn't matter. All we do is text anymore. We're so domesticated. Might as well do it on the moon.
We're already on the moon, I suppose. So
Yeah.
maybe Musk is just fulfilling a pre-existing reality. He's
That's
just
it.
bringing this taking us to our final conclusion, you know. Um, but yeah, but there's certainly this whole unexplored realm of thinking in this regard with urbanization, domestication, and so forth. There's a passage from Nietzsche which I quoted in the book. I'm going to read out because I actually think it's fantastic, and it's where he walks by a row of houses, and so this is like, you know, in a town somewhere, and you know Zarathustra, he likes to wander. You
Yep.
know, he's a wandering archetype, you know, and he says, "Did a silly child perhaps take them out of its toy box?" He's talking about the houses. "If only another child would put them back in its box, and these sitting rooms and bedrooms are men able to go in and out of them. They seem to have been made for dolls or for dainty nibblers who perhaps let others nibble with them." And Zarathustra stopped and considered at length. He said, "Sadly, everything has become smaller. Everywhere I see lower doors. Anyone like me can still pass through them, but he has to stoop." And, you know, so you kind of have this stooping, this kind of lowering yourself. It's kind of this, so you can sort of see this critique uh, of urbanization, technology, and so forth, um, sort of giving us conveniences, but at the same time, it's like sort of like making us stoop to get to them. Like
Yeah.
we're we're sort of like cave people almost, who are going having to kind of like yeah, everything's secure and convenient, but there's this sort of like there's a kind of mutilation almost, which is
Yeah.
going along with our adaptation to this order.
Yeah.
And of course, the chapter he quotes here is called "Of the Virtues That Make Small," and I think that there's also a kind of distortive effect here of like, I suppose when we put ourselves inside the walls, we can make ourselves feel bigger and look bigger.
Hmm.
And like, what can do that more than anything in human history is social media.
Yeah.
Social media
Yeah.
is basically a massive projection screen that we
Yes.
can all use to sort of extend ourselves across the world.
Yeah.
And like many benefits for just international communication, like this, for example, of course. But 90% of it is kind of people just saying, "Look what I had for dinner,"
Yeah.
like extending a kind of triviality. And I don't mean to be like mean, like
Yeah.
I'm trivial in many ways, but like I don't want to project my trivialities to the world and say, look how amazing they are. I kind of want those trivialities to be sort of just private and stupid and just ignored by everyone, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that this sort of entitlement to that sort of projection of our trivialities to like, distort the size of things. Again, it comes back to this sort of distortive capacity of civilization. And I think I put out a tweet earlier and I said, in terms of media history, we're in the equivalent to what the Black Death would be to medical history, or the 30 Years War would be to military history.
Yeah.
We're in this sort of absurdity that like we're in this absurdity like and it's going to be historically like late early 21st century. That was like the media explosion of the internet, and it's just now. I'm not saying many benefits to this, like, you know, there was many benefits to the plague in certain ways, as peculiar as that might
Sure.
seem.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and also liberalism sort of came out of the 30 Years War in many ways. It sort of responded to, you
Hmm.
know, Hobbes was 17th century think, was it 17th, 16th century? But it was, well, it was the British Civil War that he responded to, which was kind of, my history is not great on this and then now, but it was similar. It was that similar time where you had these Protestant Catholic fights, but you also had like the king versus
Yeah.
you had the church versus the king, the state versus the church, blah blah blah. You've got
Hmm.
these different power structures fighting each other, and liberalism very much came out of that sort of crisis. So I'm not saying this about the media, the Black Death of media society, as if
Sure.
it's a purely bad thing, but we are in this sort of like absolutely a crazy ass time of kind of crisis in this regard. And what are we going to do? Like, you know,
Yeah.
there's capacity for people to just project themselves around the world. Like, look, I'll have a dinner. I mean, this might seem trivial and stupid, but the consequences are terrible. Like, look what dating apps are doing to people, the
Yeah.
capacity for people to meet up. And I have very peculiar opinions of dating apps, which don't fit the whole normal critique of them. But nonetheless, it's a kind of like, you know, if you're an attractive girl, you can have thousands of matches and followers, and there's this sort of the distortion that has in people's
Yeah.
brains. Like, it's
Yeah.
just, it's not taken seriously, you know.
No. No.
And that's a distortion of civilization. That's a
Yeah.
distortion of, and it's not just civilization. It's not just having too much wealth or having too much uh, like, you know, too much law, order and blah blah blah. It's specifically a kind of distortion of this spatial anthropology we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's a kind of um, um, sense of motivation, the climbing of the mountain, the journey. We've been kind of deprived of that. And we've also been able to, like, in replace kind of that Virillian digital sort of a polar inertia, as he called it. Like, you know, we can sort of travel around the world from a
Yeah.
screen, which means that in some sense we are like, in some sense we feel. And here's the, I'll just throw back to you in a second, but we feel like we're big. We feel
Yes.
like we can go anywhere. But you've got like people today, everyone has like anxiety about everything, and like people don't even want to go to the next
Yes.
town over. You know what I mean? But they can feel like they can travel the world in a second. And the thing about the technology we have today, actually, the two big explosions of technology in the late 20th and 21st centuries have been pharmaceutical and digital, right? Like, the pill, antidepressants, blah blah blah, and also screens, all these screen technologies, instant communication. These technologies don't really give us much of a capacity to master nature. You know what I mean? They give us the feeling
Yes.
that we're the pharmaceutical feeling, the chemical feeling, or the kind of digital feeling that we're bigger and more important than we actually are. They give us this kind of like they're distortive technologies, and I don't know if people have realized this yet.
Yeah.
That our civilization is no longer this kind of Apollonian Faustian thing. Like
Yeah.
it's I don't know what to call it. It's this kind of it's exactly what Nietzsche just described in that section. It's this kind of stooping, distortive derangement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
No, magnificent. Well, there's a few things that come to mind. There's a way in which maybe we can associate thymos with horizon, logos with walls, and eros with objects. And you see, because, logos divides and separates, it defines and pulls apart rationality. Eros tends to be holding and taking. An object is detached, so you can bring it, whereas thymos has a certain horizon. And we exist in an age where, as we are stooping and becoming more and more smaller, where we have lots of walls, we have lots of objects, but we don't have any horizons. And actually, we're going to get to the place where what we want now is just pure objects. So we want to get rid of the walls. We want to feel like we can go anywhere, but not be able to go anywhere and have to face a horizon because that makes us too anxious. And what's very interesting is the screen, like you said, to go to the digital feels like you can go anywhere. It feels like it has horizons, but it actually doesn't, because the difference is to go to the horizons of nature, you have to rise yourself to be capable of it. Whereas online, it will give you whatever you want. You don't have to run or practice or train or anything to go online, right? Whereas the infinite horizons of nature, the practically infinite horizons of nature do demand something of you, right? And so what we've done is we said, screw nature. We went inside with walls and objects, right? So we got rid of horizons. And actually, I think in all honesty, the very fact that as people get older, they tend to go to oceans if they can afford it. They either end up in the damnation of a nursing home of pure walls, or if they have money, they go to a horizon. Shows that there's almost a subconscious itch in the back of the mind that has not been scratched for the experience of horizons. I can't prove that, but I do sometimes even think minimalism is a subconscious desire to get back to the horizon. So you start sacrificing the objects, but the problem is you still have walls. You can't replicate horizons except by going outside. But there are all these kind of subconscious efforts of people to replicate it without actually doing it. I think also, as another point, we've conflated destroying nature with mastering nature. And so we're very confused. There's a lot of environmentalism that are we need to learn to live with nature. That sounds like it would be addressing this problem. But honestly, a lot of the environmentalism is simply we need to stop destroying nature, not go take a walk in the woods. It may say that, but it's more like go take a walk in the woods to learn to love nature so you stop destroying it. That's not the same as we need to master nature, to be the kind of beings that can, walk long distances, go to the top of mountains. We've conflated destroying and mastering nature. So we're like, oh no, we don't want to master nature. But these are actually different things. I don't master what I destroy, right? If I destroy the mountain, did I master it? Not really. I destroyed it, right? So the other thing that has happened is we don't have a category of mastering that isn't destroying or getting rid of. Because we tend to be like, oh, I mastered, this thing if it's under my power, right? Whereas in nature, it's you master nature to the degree you can handle nature. You're a master wrestler, not to the degree that you kill your opponent, but to the degree you win. You're able to have mutual respect, right? So I think the categories of destroy and master have also gone together. That has confused us, but makes sense in a technocratic society where everything is about dividing, changing into your own image and transforming. Technology is, how do we change nature into our own image? Well, our image sucks. So we're changing it into a highway and a parking way, right? The problem with logic is we do in fact change everything into our own image, and our image is pretty bland. We're really bland. So, when you're changing nature into our own image and we're boring, then nature is like a highway, right? Let me put it this way. You cannot change nature. You cannot change nature into your image and it not be bland unless you master nature, which means you respect it and you become thymotic, at which point you don't need a parking lot because you're able to walk in the woods and you don't need a car, right? That gets into what you were saying with Plato, where the thymotic naturally balances the logos and the appetite. I think it also, the thymotic balances the tendency to conflate destroy and master. Because the reason you destroy nature is because you can't handle it. And if you can handle it, why would you destroy it, right? Actually, destroying it is to remove the opportunity to show your mastery, right? So that's also a problem, is our idea when the Bible, like, again, when the Bible, like in Genesis, is talking about dominating nature. Ladies and gentlemen, they cannot possibly mean cutting down every tree and destroying everything. Nature, for most of human history, killed you. That's what it did. It killed you. It made you cold. It took your food and you died. So when Genesis is like dominate nature, what it means is like show your mastery over it and earn a mutual respect. Like you're not going to destroy nature. Let's say we nuke I'll stop. Let's say you nuke the planet. Okay, in 1 billion years, nature wins. You can never destroy nature. It might be 1 billion years, but nature wins. It always does, right? So the best you can do is learning to cohabitate, to have a mutual respect with nature, right? And that's what it would mean to master it. And actually, the human being is better for that because the human is more thymotic. If we learn to climb mountains, walk in the woods, to be outside in cold temperatures, and we're not so domesticated, right? So there's something like there's also something with the idea of like the more and more you are, the funny thing about a city, there is nowhere in a city that you couldn't go if there wasn't arbitrary barriers, right? Like you could go anywhere. Like what building can you not go into physically? You just don't have the money. Well, money means you can't go in. Oh, you don't know the people who live here, you can't go in, so on and so forth, right? Like a city is full of places that are easy to enter that you're not allowed to enter. Whereas nature is primarily a place of, well, not easy to enter, but you're allowed to, right? So a city is a perpetual architecture of authoritarianism. Because it's like you got to know people, you got to have money, you got to have a connection. When nature is like, yeah, try me. Can you? Let's see, man. You can come up here. Can you? And that is a very, very different relationship because in a city, you're constantly being told it doesn't matter what your body can do. It doesn't matter if you can open this door. You don't know the guys, you can't go in. Whereas, yes, when they were, you hear this all the time. In the past, yes, there was private property and individual homes, but people didn't lock their doors. People were outside. Kids were the relationship to inside spaces was much more fluid, right? Like there were town circles, there were markets, there were places you could sit out. Like I think we're trying to replicate that with the coffee shop where you can just go hang out for a long time, but it's contained. So it simply supports the ideology because like, yeah, you can go and hang out and come and go as you want. Now it's $6 for coffee or whatever, but it creates this kind of just enough of a feeling of the coming and going freely to not make you critique the whole, which is mostly a system of arbitrary restriction, right? And basically the city says if you want to enter, you need to figure out how to get money, or you need to be smart enough to figure out how to get in that building. Nature doesn't care how smart you are. Nature's like the only way you access nature and get to the top of this mountain is thymos. You must climb the mountain. And if you turn around and say, no, I'll use a helicopter, that actually is admitting your defeat. Like that's kind of the key move. If you use a helicopter, nature actually won. You couldn't do it. Actually, you needed to use a technology. And that's where you're using technology to domineer nature versus master it, per se. To get over nature, well, maybe that's why we don't have a good human nature, because we're not actually mastering nature, which is actually the only way to master human nature, because they are fundamentally connected thymotically. And so then human nature is, well, bland and boring, dang it. So like the entire urban structure is one giant screaming of it doesn't matter if you can open the door. It doesn't matter physically what you can do. You're not allowed. So it's all authoritarian. Like the city screams authoritarianism. Whereas nature, it's just in being itself poses a challenge. And you can either rise to it or not. And that, the architecture of the city then has this endless reinforcement of authority and anti-thymos. Like if you're not going to do well in a city because you are thymotically advanced. You're going to do well in a city because you're logos or eros advanced, right? And actually a city is logos plus, like a city is basically logos plus it. You figured out how to get money and then you spend it. You figured out how to get money and then you consume. That's what a city primarily is. It has a little gem over here to remind you it cares about the body, but that's just ideology preservation. You have that to make it seem like the people care about thymos when really they don't, because you go to the gym to simply be better at your entrepreneurship. You do your cold shower not to like climb the mountain, but so that you can make more money to play the anti-thomos game. I guess that would be the problem, is a lot of this optimization stuff that has a thymotic form to it is for the sake of logos and eros, as opposed to for the sake of surviving in nature, for the sake of like rising to the occasion, right? It's about the city. Optimization as such is for the logic of the city, not for the logic of outside, right? Not for the logic of nature, right? And so then it's not thymotic. It has an appearance of the thymotic, but it ultimately is not. And it can't lead to a certain fulfillment of the human being. There's more to say, but let me throw it back at you.
Yeah, no, that's I really like this structure of Thymos, horizon, logos, walls, and Eros object.
Yep,
Yeah,
yep.
and no, it's fantastic. Yeah, I wrote that down, so I'm going to credit you for that next time I write stuff, because that's really because exactly it's it's exactly the kind of modern state technology and capitalism, like it's what it gives you, and also not just in the West, like in
Yep.
these wealthy Asian countries too, like you have you, you have objects being given to us the whole time, like go supermarket, whatever you want. I mean, there's a bit of Marxian fetishism we could even go into here as well, and like this kind of presentation, this ease, this ergonomic sort of giving, not giving, but just kind of provision. I suppose we can talk about it. Kind of civilization is kind of constant, pretty giving you a kind of provisional understanding of yourself. Instead of a sort of I don't know how do you put it, an understanding of yourself, which is more about a horizon, as you
Yeah.
could say. So it's this kind of rational and appetitive society, and it's giving you lots of walls, giving you lots of objects, but it's not giving you horizons, and that perfectly fits the whole theme of the end of history. No more
Yep.
horizon.
Yep.
The problem with the end of
Yep.
history is it's not that we don't have objects and walls. We got so many fucking objects and walls, and screens are in some sense a kind of a wall. I mean,
Absolutely.
they're kind of a weird wall that you can look through, but they're still a wall.
Yep.
And I think that's 100% correct. And yeah, I suppose this theme of mastering nature versus destroying nature is interesting too. I do see, well, first of all, like I think that the climate issues uh, have forced a kind of awareness around a kind of limitation to production, to logos and eros, to kind of mix together in this kind of
Yes.
pathological. I think that's what we're talking about. It's kind of pathological conspiracy going on between logos and eros, like between
Yeah.
it's like rational technology, utilitarianism, and so forth, mixed with a kind of unleashing of desire, an unleashing of objects, an unleashing of provision, an unleashing of appetite and acquisition. And I think that you got a conspiracy going on between
Yes.
those two parts, and that's changed the whole way, because you still get kind of like, I don't know, like kind of typical ecologists talking about, we want to dominate nature, we want to master nature. It's like, if we don't though, like we want to sort of I don't know, distort nature or something. We
Yes.
want to we want
That's
to
right.
use nature to sort of like fetishize
Yes.
something about our own civilization and our own existence.
Exactly.
It's not really this traditional sort of Faustian Western man wants to conquer them. It's moved. It's moved outside of that,
Absolutely.
into this strange new territory, which I think we're only beginning to sort of contemplate now. I also agree with your point on nukes. I'm increasingly skeptical of nukes, and like how we think of them, and like how they've affected everything. also the whole thing about war, but just we have this idea of like planetary destruction, as you were saying. Nature will come back. It will just come back. Like it could take a million years, but it will come back. And perhaps we've inflated our own power in this regard.
Absolutely.
Like, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't have responsibility about things, but like we have inflated our own power. And again, it kind of reminds me of something Sloterdijk said. He actually has a talk. I'll send you a link to it later, but it's called it's he's talking about cities and urbanization, and he actually quotes Epicurus, and he says Epicurus said, like, when it comes to death, we all live in a city without walls, right? So we don't have a defense. It doesn't matter how many walls you have.
Yeah.
Death is coming for us all. And there's this sort of, there's the nature creeping in the back door again. Every time we throw it out, it creeps in the back door. And there is I suppose that does push us into the thymotic territory, because it's like, well, what do? You can't pleasure yourself out of the reality of nature. You can't like wall yourself in from it, like figuratively or literally. So the only thing is to sort of like overcome it in some sort of spiritual sense, even. So that's kind of like a curveball for modern civilization. Is there a political party? Is there a religious order? Is there anyone who's like, telling us this? Because I think telling people this today will be the equivalent to sort of like, the kind of Zarathustra figure coming down from the mountaintop and being told to piss off. It's like no one wants to hear it. They really, really don't. Like, they really don't. I've had conversations with like, they're not like greatly philosophical people, but they're like, kind of normies. And like, I do worry about, this sort of idea that we can sort of, like progress and technology and so forth will kind of insulate us from anything negative, anything bad, any pain, and so on and so forth. And like, people really have internalized this idea of the civilization, the progress can actually play that role. Yep. And I don't know what to say about it, other than everyone's going to be in a lot of disappointment for the next few decades. So good luck to them.
No,
anyway, I'll throw it back to you there.
No, completely magnificent. I think the screen is the perfect wall object, because it is a wall that has infinite objects, right? Like, it's the perfect conspiratorial. Like you mentioned, exactly right, that it's a conspiracy of Eros and Logos against Thymos. There's nothing better than the screen, because it's objects on a wall. It's, well, you mentioned it in the pod, Plato's cave, right? Like, the screen is basically Plato's cave. You mentioned that in your work. The screen is a wall that you forget is a wall. Whereas at least when I look at that, I know it's a wall, but a screen, you forget it's a wall. The very awkwardness of saying it's a wall is a testament to that reality. And the reason you forget it's a wall is because it keeps flashing objects at you. So it's a perfect conspiratorial object of Logos and Eros against Thymos, right? Because it's dividing you from the world. It feels rational. It's technological. It's a testament to logic and rationality. And it's showing you things to think about and to direct your logical mind. And then you're using logic in service of figuring out what you want to enjoy or what objects you want. It's perfectly cyclic. Like, a screen is an infinite source of scratching the itch of Logos and Eros, but never Thymos. But it does it in such a way that you forget Thymos, because it does it so well. It accelerates you so quickly in your movement. It makes you feel like it's all Virilio, like your tremendous course with Hansen, is like that you actually forget Thymos until you look up. And then when you look up, it's like, I don't like these walls. Let me go back to this wall. And then what ends up happening is it becomes too painful to go outside. And then you just that is the death drive, basically, at that point, right? That the screen being, as Cadell talks about, and death drive tend to go together, not because death drive is fundamental, but because we can't think of horizon as distinct from wall and object, and therefore it seems like the death drive is fundamental, when really that's just it's practically fundamental, not technically fundamental, because of how we've arranged the social order, right? It's almost technically fundamental, but it's more like practically fundamental because of how we've arranged our being domestically, right? I think also on the English Civil War, a big movement of that was the idea with Cromwell, I believe, it's the idea that that's where, like, sovereignty rests with the people instead of the king, right? Like it's a moment where the king dies with the Civil War, you have that. And so the idea of sovereignty being from the people versus the king really comes up. Well, the reason why this is the beginning, in my opinion, of the loss of thymos, though it didn't have to be, is because then what ended up happening is you go, oh, well, if the market can figure out how to control the people, it controls sovereignty. This is the brilliance of capital. Like if you have a king, like a king can say, screw you, capital, I'm the king. But if capital is like, well, if we use algorithms, desire products, and all these other things, we actually become the source of sovereignty through the people because they're just puppets now, right? They're dolls, right? And also, you mentioned dolls, and there's that wonderful Ghost in the Shell Innocence too, where basically that movie is about, well, if humans give up on being gods, we can, something that's very godlike is a doll. Doesn't die, doesn't age, always beautiful, malleable, and playful. In a world where we've given up on gods, we become dolls, right? And that's basically what, well, capital promises you. And then it's doll sovereignty, and whoever controls the dolls has the sovereignty, so capital gets the sovereignty, right? Like, here's the issue. It's seemingly easier for capital, well, certainly with technology. Before technology like we had, it was more like breaking up, decentralizing sovereignty to the people seemed like a pretty good idea, right? Because then it's decentralized, it's going to break up. But then capital, if you grant that loaded phrase, and I'm not trying to be anti-capitalistic in all sense, but I think capital as a signifier of this neoliberalism is fair. Well, capital figured out how to control the people. So it technically doesn't have the sovereignty, but it practically does. That's the loophole in this problem, right? That's how we got, like, the English Civil War was a way to address the problem of the corruption of the sovereignty source of the king or whatever, and decentralizing it, breaking it up to the people was a pretty good strategy. But then, unfortunately, capital figured out how to manipulate the people, and so that doesn't work unless people regain their sovereignty. There's only one way to regain your sovereignty: mastery, right? Like if you're in a conspiracy between Eros and Logos, you don't have a sovereignty unless you can, escape that conspiracy, and that requires thymos, and but then the conspiracy has convinced us that mastery is destroying. So if we simply destroy nature, we destroy pain, we destroy sickness, we destroy make them solvable, then we're good to go. Actually, that just makes it unbearable, as Illich said, and we're actually further disabled, and you get all these problems, right? So we think if we destroy illness and pain, we will be masters. We think if we destroy the difficulties of nature if we destroy the difficulty of the mountain by inventing the helicopter, that therefore we will have mastered it, when that's a counterfeit. That is a trick of the conspiracy of Logos and Eros against thymos, actually. It's not mastery at all. It's disablement. That looks like mastery, but actually the master is capital. Because capital for Nick Land is technology. That's the logic. And before I forget, I do think, like, Mikey Downs does a lot to link Nick Land to Marx and capital and all these different things. And Marx is interesting. You were mentioning this with Samuel Barnes. There is a conservative Marx, actually. There is a lot of valuable material work in Marx. It's when you get into other things that you can critique. I think it would require scholarship. It's a lot of the question of surplus value, where Marx bases the idea that surplus value is injustice. Basically, the neo-Keynesian Steve King, who has a deep respect for Marx, I think he put it correctly when he said the mistake is that surplus value does not necessarily lead to a workers' revolution. Because do you know what the ultimate source of surplus value is? The machine. The machine gives you infinite surplus value. So the problem of surplus value just leads to technology. It does not lead to a workers' revolution, because all that happens is we replace workers with machine, because there's no greater source of surplus value than the machine. So I like to take Stephen King's point on surplus value heading toward technology, combine it with Nick Land, as Mikey Downs works on. Fukuyama basically does the following. He says, and you're right, end of history, there's no horizons. And I don't think he's ignorant. I think he's like, yeah, there's no thymos, but he's like, what's the alternative? Well, the problem is, if there's no alternative, then Nick Land wins, AI takes over, the Dark Enlightenment, the climate crisis gets worse, and AI. And actually, I also think that capitalism leads to a great stagnation, like Peter Tone and Cohn says, like it literally stagnates wages collapse, the iron law of wages, as Marx calls it. But I think like looking at oh gosh, Earl Thompson or different things, like what ends up happening is profit outpaces wages, and then you get stagnation. Okay, so here's the thing. The conspiracy of Eros and Logos against Thymos, we'll use these three, calls three crises. Let's just say three for now. There's more, but let's just say that. We're going to say climate, stagnation, and AI. Okay, so I have in mind climate change or whatever. Stagnation, I have Keynes, Cohn, and all of them. Economic stagnation. AI, I have Nick Land in mind. What's very interesting is I would argue all of those create crises in areas that are lacking thymos, actually. You have a climate crisis because we don't master nature. We don't know how to master nature, and we're trying to make it in our own image, which is bland. So then you get all these unintentional consequences. We get economic stagnation because we actually don't know anymore how to innovate and to create businesses. We just make like financial instruments, liquidity. We have a very odd form of capitalism, cloud capitalism. So you get the stagnation. And AI with the technology is, well, everything we talk about, technology replacing humanity, right? So you got all three of those crises. And the issue is there's actually a kind of grace in the fact that those crises are there, because what they are all pointing at is a lack of thymos that you have to look like. And right now we find ourselves facing subjects of thymos without the frame of thymos. We're looking at these three, and even the guy on the street know that all three of these are the subjects of thymos, even if they don't have the frame to think of them as thymotic. Like that's what's going on. These three crises are about subjects of thymos. We just don't have the frame of thymos. But if at least everyone is looking at crises that are a result of a thymotic problem, then there's at least the hope that there's a place for the frame to get in there, right? And then you could see them. Oh, that's what the meaning crisis is. It's a motivational crisis due to a lack of the thymotic. It's not a result of a lack of the logos or the lack of the eros. It's actually a loss of the joint recognition, the joint attention. Oh, memetics is an issue because we don't have the joint attention. Oh, there's a lack of horizons, right? So there's a kind of grace in a perverted sort of sense in that these crises that are becoming undeniable, increasingly, no matter how advanced the conspiracy of Eros and Logos against Thymos becomes, it cannot stop the crises that result from a lack of Thymos, right? Because they're a result of a lack of thymos. It can cover them, it can hide them, it can try to plug us in the matrix, but it can't help but have those crises occur, right? If they occur, and the only way to address them is a recovery of the thymotic, then there's hope. Because more and more there's a kind of forcing function to force the average to look at them, right? And then especially when it turns out that the stuff we're doing ain't working, then you start becoming open to different possibilities, right? And basically, it will have something to do with a recovery of the horizon in a world where all we have is walls and objects. But that's where work, that's where work like yours is so important, because we, no matter, these forcing functions have to push us into new ideas. And if those books don't exist, it's going to be very hard to think those ideas.
Yeah, no, that was good. I think maybe even I coined a little term there when you were speaking. Horizontal being, like a kind of horizontal being needs to manifest, I think, because that would deal with, I think, the anthropology, but it would also deal with the historical issue of not having a shared goal and so forth. And I think that, I was thinking of Musk as well there, and I'm like, I kind of see, like, I think about Elon Musk too much on a day-to-day basis. but he is an interesting character because he does like come about, I think. I think he's a Gen Xer too, and he kind of pushes back against some of the kind of stagnant, kind of spiritless, sort of exhausted sort of character of the boomers, and the technocratic kind of order. And he tries to give us a new thing, as he's going to make a rocket ship and go to the go to the moon or whatever. But the point isn't just to give us a new goal. The point is to give us horizontal being itself back. So it's not like, don't give us a new goal that will just give us like 5 years of, oh, that'll be cool, and it will only involve a tiny small amount of people, and it won't really change my life on a day-to-day basis. Go to the moon if you want. Like, I'm still, just going to be doing my thing. Like, it's not really going to make a huge difference. Like, and you can write it in the history books, whatever, blah blah blah. But this kind of horizontal being, it needs to be like a project that doesn't destroy the very horizontal being itself. So it's got and this is the whole end of history problem. Is it like, it's like, oh, history's not over because we haven't completed it yet. And it's like, But the point of history isn't just to be complete in this sense of like, well, now there's nothing left to do, or to to be drawn towards, to be the point should be to kind of give us motivation and goal and horizon, but give us back the being, not the specific event or specific place, specific object, but the being itself. And like that would require a project which doesn't just kind of eat itself. You know what I mean? Like a project like, okay, well, and this is exactly the kind of technological and appetitive issue, because appetite's like I want more, so I get more, and then it doesn't fulfill it, and you get more. Technology is like, we need something new to progress into, and like, okay, so let's go to the moon. But it's like, but you're just like, you're gonna turn the world more into a place where we're trapped more behind walls and screens, and we lose more motivation because everything's becoming easier in some sense, more convenient. And we need the horizontal being itself to be recreated. Actually, just a kind of practical example I was thinking of was like, I was watching an interview recently with Unheard, and they were this German kind of journalist was on, and I think he lives in the UK in London, but he was talking about how like Germany's always been criticized for like being stuck in the kind of social democratic industrial stage of civilization, where he should be in the more in the digital, I don't know what, the digital stage of civilization. And there is a bit of an issue in the sense that Europe doesn't really have like a rivalry to Silicon Valley. And as much as I agree that Europe would be good to have like its own sort of digital infrastructure, it's like, don't sort of present, the end of our civilization as like, this sort of prepackaged kind of digi-capitalist thing that is so pathological to begin with. Like I think this is my problem with libertarians as well, is that they always think like deregulate the market and then like you'll have a kind of explosion of creativity. But the point isn't that the point isn't that you need to deregulate the market and you have explosion of creativity. I mean, I'm sure there's lots and lots of specific laws where if you put them in front of me, I'd be like, I'm like, that's a bit unfair on small business people. That's a bit not fair. That's a bit too much tax. I'm sure, like, I'm not saying that like there's no argument there at all, but it's like if you're framing the next stage of civilization or the next kind of collective project in merely economic terms, then as you were kind of saying, like, you're missing the point. Like, you're missing the point of what needs to reemerge is that thematic. And when I say thematic, also, like, we should also expand. And I think it's obvious, if anyone's listened to this conversation and they've made it this far, they should get this already. But like, just in case anyone doesn't, it's not just a simple, cheap psychological thing, like pride, recognition, because like I can feel recognition from social media, but it's empty recognition. Like, there's a kind of standard to it, just like there's a standard to everything, to real thinking versus superficial mental like games, there's a standard to everything. And I'm really talking about a kind of spirit and a kind of negativity and a kind of almost an absurdity, which can't be kind of reduced to the rational or the appetitive, I think is important. But I know one more thing to say. Talking about the next stage of civilization, blah 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 blah. I've forgotten. I had something else, but I've completely libertarians. I was complaining about libertarians. Okay, I'm doing it over. Okay, I was complaining about libertarians. I said,
well, it's all in an economic calculus, you were saying, and it's pre-framed, and that's not the point. And well, I mean, not to cut you off. I mean, that point is so important because it is the mistake of reifying, like with it's so much of it is based on the thesis, the Turner thesis of the frontier thesis, right? Like, oh man, America was at its best when there was a frontier, when there were new lands to explore, and so on and so forth. Yes. But the key to that is we didn't know what was there. We do know what's on Mars, actually. We know what's there. That's why it's not going to work. Because the Turner thesis requires an unknown for social imagination. That's why it's thematic, right? Like, when you're going out west, or go back to freaking Netherlands with the Dutch trading company going across the ocean. People literally didn't know what would occur, right? Like, you cannot overstate the importance of running into America when you thought you would end up in China, because suddenly the world was a different place. Oh, frick. So the key is there was an unknown, like really very strongly unknown, that spurs possibility and social imagination that is not reducible to an economic calculus. That's the key. Like, the greatest points, the greatest moments of enrichment that happened in human civilization, which leads to looks primarily economic, but there is actually ahead of it a change of social imagination. That's critical. Dietrich Miklowski calls it rhetoric. There was a change in how people talked about work. They had a different social imagination about what it meant to work. Suddenly work could be dignified. Suddenly work could be experimental, and bam, everything changed. But it wasn't primarily money. The money followed the social imagination. And honestly, when you get to this point of the kind of the question, it's very small nuances and very small differences. The social imagination is a little bit ahead of the economic well-being that makes it look like it was primarily deregulation and freedom and all of that exploded. No, the change in the social imagination is what led to the freedom, and then the freedom had a thematic organization that then led to the enrichment, right? The reason why going to Mars will not do that is because we know it's on Mars. It's not social imagination. It's simply a technical problem. Going in the Turner thesis, the American frontier was not a technical problem. It was a thymotic problem. You get in a freaking wagon and you'll probably die. That's primarily thymotic. That's not a technical problem. Going to Mars is technical. If you die, it's because you did the technology wrong. Out west, if you die, it's because you weren't like tough enough, or you didn't build the building correctly, or you didn't have food, you didn't hunt it. Like, dying on the frontier was fundamentally like tough. You know, it was more human. It was far more human. If a bunch of people die going to Mars, we're not going to say they weren't tough. We're going to say we need to do what? Design a better spaceship. There is no possibility of a human being living on Mars without technology. Zero. There is lots of possibilities of someone living out west without technology. They literally go out, and you can't bring a house to frickin' Oregon. You have to cut down the trees and build it yourself, right? If we go to Mars, we're going to bring material. At the very least, bring material to build the construction site that will provide the resources for the house. But we're going to bring things. Like, when they're in a covered wagon, they're not, half the stuff, they're bringing a lot of tools, right? Like, it's not really material. You're bringing tools to face an unknown. Like, to go to Mars, you're going to have to plan. That's a key word. Plan ridiculously, to the point where preparation is basically irrelevant. Like, the plan is the preparation. Going out west on the Turner thesis is primarily, are you prepared for the winter? Are you prepared to hunt? Are you prepared for the unknown? You cannot plan for the Oregon Trail. That's the whole idea. But it's precisely in that condition that social imagination takes off, right? Social imagination will not take off going to Mars. Because it's a technical problem. In fact, it will just simply reify the focus on technology, because that's the only way we live in space, right? So the irony is, in my opinion, the desire to go to Mars, which seems to be bringing back the frontier thesis, is its death. It's the death of the frontier. There is no frontier now. They're simply technical problems. It's a great irony and dangerous, actually. So social imagination is first. The frontier for me is the unknown. Let me tell you what the frontier is. Neoliberal, horizontal being, dang it. Like, thymotic neoliberalism, like a capitalism that doesn't destroy thymos. That's a freaking frontier. That's a hard problem. A truly hard problem. You know how they talk about the hard problem? Like, we like going to Mars. That's a hard problem. No, it's a technical problem. A hard problem is one where you don't even know you don't even know how to frame it, dang it. How do we even frame the problem? That's a hard problem. We should not conflate, if we use the Schumpeter's, like when he talked about the hard problem of consciousness, right? The reason why he calls that a hard problem is because we don't even know the framing of the problem. We know the framing of the problem of going to Mars. That's why it's a technical problem. Maybe it's a difficult technical problem, but it's not a hard problem. A hard problem is very unknown. Like, you know there's a problem, but you're struggling even to feel it, right? That's why consciousness is a hard problem. A frontier must be a hard problem. If it is not a hard problem, it doesn't stimulate social imagination, because what stimulates social imagination? Trying to even think the problem. Like we have to get imaginative because we can't even think the problem. So hard problems are ones that create social imagination because it always is a failure of rationality. You don't even know the problem. Rationality can't even figure out the problem. It can't even figure out the problem. So you have to start imagining. You have to move to imagination, which is non-rational. And imagination is much more thymotic. Look at that mountain. Imagine yourself going there. Imagine what could be. You cannot know unless you go. You imagine. When you have an unknown, drive is very imagination-based. Now, because it is imagination-based, it can become irrational. Therefore, if logos comes in and tries to correct it. But then if you have no possibility of the irrational, you also have no possibility of the non-rational, at which point you're doomed. You have a Nash equilibrium and you're going to have no trouble, right? So you have to have imagination. And the problem is, just look back on the American, there's all these freaking tall tales, Shangri-La, Golden Cities, like going to these unknown places, Marco Polo. It's full to the brim of imagination. There is really no imagination going to Mars. It's the same science fiction stories from the 1920s. Like I was saying this, when is the last time there's been a truly imaginative science fiction story? They're always robots. They're always space stations. It's actually very, very effing similar for a very long time. This is not social imagination. This is just different clothing of technological solutions, but not addresses of the human condition, right? So it's just a repetition that we think is new because it's about things that don't exist yet. But just because it's a repetition about things that don't exist doesn't mean that it's just old. It's always spaceships. Is there really that much difference between Star Trek and Star Wars? I'm not saying they're bad. I'm not saying that one isn't better than the other. But in the content, on what you see, when you see going to space, they're very similar because surviving in space is going to require very similar things, right? So there's not really much social imagination. But if I start talking to you about the hard problem of thymos under neoliberalism, of horizontal being, frick, like that's really imaginative. That's really hard to think. It seems so impossible that we don't even try now. We just don't even try. Just get a better screen, right? Like that's a frontier. And I love what you're saying. And then I'll give it back to you. I love the idea of horizontal being. Dr. Niebuhr with Heidegger talks about death as the horizon of being. Well, that makes sense. It's thymotic. There's a threat. You can't have a horizon if you don't have a certain like mountain range, a certain depth, or different things. Also, I think, Cadell talks about screen being. So it's, basically we need horizontal being in an age of screen being, where everyone's on the screen all the time. And screen being is the perfect conspiracy of frickin' eros and logos. Screen, objects, wall, right there, right? So we need horizontal being. And again, the main problem, and then I'll give it to you, and then I will have to close. I don't know where the time goes. I love speaking with you. Going to Mars will not make us frickin' horizontal being. It seems like it, but it will not, because we know what's there. And what's that spaceship going to be filled with? What's it going to be filled with? Screens. What are we going to do on Mars? Look at screens. Like, are you going to go outside? Like, literally on Mars, you will not go outside. You will die. Like, there is no frickin' taking a walk. There is no climbing a mountain. There's dying, right? So, like that, and yeah, I mean, so much of the going to Mars is basically the Earth's going to get blown up. We got to go elsewhere. Well, if we're going to blow up Earth, why wouldn't we just blow up Mars? Like, we're just going to nuke that too, right? Like, if we literally can't learn to master nature on Earth because we conflate master and destroy, why would going to Mars make a difference? We're just going to destroy that as well. It's not a solution. Because the thing that has made human beings what we are is a change in social imagination. And that's something that libertarian assume, in my opinion, libertarianism assumes in the myth of autonomous freedom, which is if you make people free, you simply get prosperity. Not even Adam Smith said that. Autonomous rationality does not give you a better world. Autonomous freedom doesn't give you a better world. It's social imagination, which is always a product of all three, eros, thymos, and logos in harmony with one another, which is very difficult because the human has to be the composer of that harmony, which again, like you were saying in your brilliant Substack, that's why you need that philosopher always present in your society to help people think the problem of that harmony, because if they forget the problem of that harmony, they also forget they forget. So the philosopher has this perpetual social role of providing the memory of the need for that thing, which if they get captured by this conspiracy of screen being, they won't do, and then you forget. And it should be noted, damnation in Dante is where you forget you forgot. Dante remembers he forgot something in the dark wood, That's why he's able to go through it to the Paradiso, where in the Inferno, they forget because they cross the river. So the key to life is remembering you forgot something, which is slightly different than forgetting you forgot, which is to experience yourself as not forgetting anything. Well, that's why you're damned. Once you forget you forgot, you're damned because you have no hope. If you remember you forgot, there's hope. The role of without philosophers in your society, then the likelihood you forget you forgot is incredibly low, and at that point, screen being wins. And there's little hope for horizontal being. Thus, the importance of someone like you doing the work you do in the society we're in to help us remember something that we forgot. So I appreciate it, Owen. Any last thoughts, my friend?
Yeah, no, a few last thoughts. That was great, though. Social imagination. That was a very, very good encapsulation of what I think the problem is. And like, I think you put it well. Like, my problem also, like, it used to be more of a Marxist, and like, my problem with Marx is exactly this: is that like the problem with capitalism isn't that what you've got. I mean, okay, the exploitations can be bad, but of course, commodification is terrible, blah 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 blah. Most Marxists today will say something about like inequality, billionaires, and so on.
Yeah.
But the problem really is exactly that: is it like that it destroys the horizontal being, and like that's its problem. And if it didn't do that, I'd be more open to
Yeah, exactly.
I'd be more open to seeing its value and benefits. I obviously regulated in a way
Sure.
that so it can't do the thing that it's done, you know. But you know, so like exactly that. This is interesting thing about these conversations is that like they kind of get you to a kind of political position, but the problem is, can I go to the parliament tomorrow and go, all right, I'm setting up a party and it's like we're okay with a bit of capitalism, but like as long as it doesn't destroy horizontal being. Like people are gonna go, all right, like to understand what I mean by that, you're gonna have to go through this, see in 10 years, you know, and then we'll set up a party, and I'll have like 5 recruits. You know what I mean? Like this is the problem with politics today,
Yeah.
is that like you just can't like there's like the left right paradigm's broken down, the whole even capitalist communist paradigms are kind of all over the place, and there's just no sense of where we are in that. But that actually was very helpful, because it's, you know, and it's probably what we should do with politics today is like figure out like not like okay, let's get rid of this, but like what's the thing about this which is really fucking everyone up. Like we're not gonna get rid of technology, we're not gonna get rid of screens, but what's the thing about screens that's really
Exactly.
bad, and then we can have an argument about the specific implementations and
Yes.
regulations of this stuff, you know, and that's fine. We're not going to agree on that. Everyone will have disagreements. I'm sure if everyone in the world, or in the, you know, whatever, let's say everyone in you know in the West understood what we were talking about tomorrow, there would still be a disagreement over the practical implementation of how do we stop the destruction of rational being.
Yeah.
It's funny to think. It's funny to think of everyone understanding that. But anyway, you know, it's like there would still be, but nonetheless, we'd at least be arguing from like sensical premises.
Yes.
Whereas like we're not at the moment.
No.
It's like, oh, capitalism, communism. And you people, I really get annoyed when people on the right like, so the Democratic Party are communist. I'm like, are they? Like, what are you talking about? Like, you know, or you get people on the left who kind of make their own like absurd accusations of people, and it's just like, no, okay, none of this makes sense. So that's just a quick
Yeah.
political point. The other thing I wanted to mention, because when I forgot talking about the libertarian thing, was it's France, right? The burning down of Notre Dame about like a year ago, I think it was, and I saw a tweet today, and it said, "Oh yeah, like France had just fixed the building, and they've really, really quickly fixed it, blah blah blah," and and they had a mass, or they had a gathering in Notre Dame. I think a lot of public leaders went, and it was a bit of an event, and someone put on Twitter an interesting post, and they said, "You see." France dropped all their regulations for this. Normally, this would take 20 years to fix, right? And I was like, because sometimes you see this kind of, I don't know, to say it like kind of pro market attack on Europe for being too regulated, right? And I'm like, yeah, but do you realize why they dropped all the regulations? It's because it's not an economic object of value. It's exactly this kind of spirited sense of their social imagination, their horizontal being, and their thematic being, and so forth. It's the Notre Dame, it's the Paris, it's you know, it's like you don't destroy this and get away with it. We will fix it. We'll drop every regulation and we will go. And that's the motivational force.
Yes.
So it's like you can't say, oh, we're going to critique all the all this kind of regulatory framework around the market, because the motivation from the very beginning in that instance wasn't the market. It was
Right.
something beyond that. So anyway, you see these contradictions coming out.
Yep.
The other thing is in relation to that I wanted to quickly mention was I'm sort of doing a bit of research at the moment on these kind of weird figures in the early Crusades, like Peter the Hermit or Walter the Penniless, who were these
Mm.
like literally like it's like reading about a stag party, like a bachelor's party. I think in America you call it bachelor's party. A bachelor's party that got way out of hand. You know what I mean? It's like this social imagination, right? And
Yep.
it's like there was a stage. Now, of course, there's plenty of bad things they did. They
Sure.
did a few pogroms against some Jewish communities. They did loads of. I'm not trying to
Yes.
scratch over that stuff, but it's really funny reading it because it's like the military didn't arrange this. The church sort of allowed a group of mavericks to sort of capture people's imagination, and
Yep.
why they could capture it at the time was important, and we won't go into that. But uh, these weird people like Peter the Hermit and like Walter the Painless, who could like they're almost like Twitter anonymous people or something, like Bronze Age pervert or something. They're kind of funny characters, you know what I mean? Like, and they kind of just captured everyone's imagination, and they
Yep.
did this completely hopeless attempt, and it went completely failed. But the thing is that like people, then military historians will say, well, that failed because they didn't have the proper strategic blah 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 blah. And I was like, yeah, but all the other things that happened after that with the more proper generals
Yeah.
wouldn't have happened if that
Exactly.
original
Yeah.
social
Yeah.
imagination didn't
Yeah.
didn't didn't. And that's exactly what we're talking about. It's like we don't lack the kind of practical means to have a good society or good civilization or good projects. It's really that social imagination that's gone.
Yes.
And there was one instance in Peter the Hermit's little journey there, which I thought was so funny because they decided to follow a goose. There was a goose that was on the voyage with them, and they decided this goose had the Holy Spirit in him, and they followed the goose for like many many kilometers. Just like this is so funny. Like this is like this like there's this interesting aspect of history which we don't talk about,
Yeah.
which is like the absurd.
Yes.
This is the absurd, and I think that's exactly what Nietzsche is trying to kind of
Yes.
capture in that tightrope analogy. 'Cause it's
Yeah.
like why the tightroper falls and he fails and everyone goes, oh, he's an idiot.
Yeah.
So they don't get it. He don't get it. They don't see the imagination
Yes.
in him and so forth. So it's
Yes.
yeah, no, it was an anecdote which I thought fitted well with with what you were saying about social imagination. So yeah, okay, well, I'll end it there.
No, it's magnificent. Well, so there's a few things. Um, I would force everyone like on that contingency, on that imagine that happenstance. Like, I find infinitely fascinating the Cuban Missile Crisis, where if you read about that and like read, say, Gambling with Armageddon or all of these different books, you see how, yeah, just random phone call saved the world, or a general just having not to turn the key. Like, had it not, we'd all be dead, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis screams constantly contingency, non-rationality, happenstance. Kennedy basically just like, so for example, Kennedy, Eisenhower kind of set up the Bay of Pigs, right? Like he set that operation and dropped it in Kennedy's lap, and Kennedy's like, oh, okay, and it goes terribly. Also, without the Bay of Pigs, it's hard to imagine Khrushchev sending the missiles over to Cuba because he thought another invasion would occur. All of these different things. Also, Eisenhower just hated Castro. So when Castro visited Nixon and was adamant, we're not communist, and Nixon, as the vice president, was like, they are, basically Eisenhower's hatred of Castro and just certainty that Castro was going to be a communist when he was actually at the time arguably more of a socialist is precisely what drove Castro into being a communist, to get support from Russia. And that just kind of like absurd conclusion, when there really was not a ton of evidence that Castro at the time was a communist, shapes a relationship that leads to a Cuban missile, just like a personal grudge kind of thing, right? And also, Eisenhower seems to have been so pissed off that Nixon lost to Kennedy because he saw it as a refutation of his entire career. He's like, hey, here's this operation we have going on in Cuba, have fun, and left it, right? Like, which then sets everything in motion. And the point of like saying all that is because Kennedy too, though, because he felt so screwed by the Bay of Pigs, when all the military generals were telling him, we've got to nuke, we've got to do this, this, and this in Cuba, he's like, no, I'm going to call Khrushchev. And because they basically have conversations, which is non-rational and more human and not really following the technocratic advice of the experts, arguably saves the world, right? So the Cuban Missile Crisis is a fascinating, like if you just as an episode to see how doing what you think is rational would get us all killed, I think is a really fascinating, and you just see how personalities and bitterness and rivalry are all in the background of, you think your government's like really calculated and that's why the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't happen? No, it's basically luck. Okay, cool. That's great. A goose. It was a goose. Kennedy followed a goose. It was a goose. So it's really, really important, that contingency. I think also, like, to me, what's really important for Marx is the principle of where Marx is at his best when he's a boring sociologist. And I think he's doing sociology before that's a thing, that people use that term, really. It's not, he's doing political economy, but he's really starts off the Capital asking, how is money possible? Like, what is the commodity? And he identifies abstract social use as the key principle. Like, things have value because they have an abstract social use. Like, what's the difference? So, for example, it's not really labor. Like, he makes a distinction. It's really important between labor and work. Like, if I go in my field and just dig a hole, am I making value? No, because nobody wants it, right? Like, I have to dig a hole when it has some sort of social use value, right? So one of the key, and this is why I think the labor theory of value is problematic, is because there's a critical distinction between labor and just toil, and labor is always socially conditioned. Well, that means what? It's a social imagination. Labor is a product of social imagination. That I imagine this is worth $5. Do you see $5 in this? No, I imagine it's worth $5, and therefore I'm willing to buy it for $5 because it has an abstract social use value. Like, it's not merely use value. When I look at the store, I'm abstracting that it has a value that other people might find valuable, and therefore M equals, it's like the continuation of the flow of capital, right? So capitalism only gets off the ground by a social imagination act, the making things valued according to social value, right? So that's really important because capitalism is not possible without a change in social imagine, to imagine things as valued according to abstract social use, right? And like Paul Planier, the Great Transformation, we can go on. Everything starts with abstract, with social imagination. But it happens so quick, and then the way you experience that social imagination is through pragmatics, practical, that you forget the imagination that's at the beginning. You lose sight of it, right? And that's when you get in trouble. And also, you just made a really important point. I think we lose sight of how much ritual and sacrifice was tied to reminders of social imagination. Like sacrifice, ritual, like you're mentioning the guys who sacrifice themselves to change the social imagination, right? We have a survivor bias in history where we tell the story of the survivors, but the only reason those people did something that they survived is because they had the social imagination to do that thing, right? Like, we tell the story of the winners of, say, the Crusades, but they wouldn't have gone on the thing they could have survived to be remembered by unless there's a goose, unless there's a social imagination at the beginning. And that's really important because you lose sight in it. You don't see in history the horizon itself. Like, you only see the course history went in, so all you see is seemingly logic. Yeah. You don't see the horizon. But that's where the story of the crazy people or the weird rituals or the sacrifices, because there's a way in which social imagination almost always starts with sacrifice. Kind of has to. If you think about it, the people that go out west are sacrificing themselves. They're putting their lives on the line. They're not seeing themselves as sacrificing themselves, but in essence they are, right? You can look at soldiers in war as kind of sacrificing themselves for the sake of the social imagination, or all of the freaking scientists who actually are imagining new ideas who are crazy or sacrifice their careers. You don't see the people who sacrifice themselves for the possibility of the thinking of the social imagination that then some people can survive enacting. And that is what gives you a misunderstanding of, well, what makes the world what it is, right? There's always that non-rational element that's hidden by the historian who only records the rational results. And as a result, you get a misunderstanding of how we ended up where we are today, and you over-index the role of things like economics, pragmatism, science, business, and all of these things, not seeing the original social imagination. That's first, like even like the history of science, for example. Like basically, oh gosh, starts with a B. I'll remember it in a minute. Like these original scientists who, Bacon. You know, Bacon comes out and he has a crazy idea. Hey, why don't we collect as many minute, nuanced details as we possibly can for science? Like in Aristotle, science, you figured out, you know, because if you could argue Aristotle's doing way more science than philosophy. He's doing a ton of science. But in Aristotle's day, and this is in the book The Knowledge Machine, I believe, and it's very good because he's trying to figure out is it Kuhn or Popper falsification paradigm. He's debating these things. But the point is, in Aristotle, a scientific problem was resolved with philosophical reasoning, okay? Like you turn to metaphysics to solve it. Bacon comes along and says, well, actually, what if we were to solve scientific dilemmas by gathering a whole lot of minute details? Like really, like just gather all the facts. We're so used to science doing that today that we can't even imagine that being an issue back then. A lot of people thought that was crazy. Why would you just gather all of these small facts? Why would you do that? Well, guess what? He had a change in social imagination that suggested that maybe this is how we ought to resolve scientific problems, right? So a crazy guy, and he was kind of crazy. I think I don't know if it's true, apparently died trying to test frozen turkeys in the snow, got a cold or died or something. Bacon's kind of nuts, but he's like almost obsessively like, let's just like obsessively hoard facts. Everyone thought that was stupid. Turned out that unlocked science. Like without this, there is no science, right? So we just tend to think that science was always the way it has been. No, science had different paradigms at different times of how to do science. The question is, how did science change to new paradigms? It's a social imagination is first. Someone imagined, let's try just gathering a bunch of facts. Do you know it's going to work? Can you prove it's going to work? No, you can't prove the methodology of science until you do it. It has to start with a social imagination. It has to change and then unlocks a lot. And so, and again, there's this non-rational, so many of these scientists are eccentric, they're odd, they're weird, they're kind of crazy. Like, but that's always underemphasized in the history books. We don't emphasize how Einstein's like kind of not a very good mathematician. He's kind of weird. He spends a whole lot of time doing a lot of science. Or frickin' Newton is alchemy. Einstein, you know what made Einstein brilliant? Is he was able to have like images of a guy in a glass elevator. It wasn't mathematics. He was just able to see. He thought in image. I think he said he thought in geometry or whatever, right? So he had images. That's imagination, dang it. So he was really good at imagination. But all we do is play up math and logos. That's not what you see in history. You see these people freaking imaginative. And we only call them genius because their imagination worked. And then when it works, we interpret it as logic. That's what we do. Imagination that works, we call logic. And so we lose sight of how it was actually a social imagination that was first that made the logic possible, that because we reinterpret in light of the logic, because it creates logically rational results. So then we call it logic, lose sight of the trace of the base, and then we end up in a conspiracy of screen being without horizontal. But if you go through history, horizontal being is primary. And again, religious sacrifice, like we're literally going to do something that seems kind of crazy and stupid simply to point to a horizon that's beyond you, right? Like that's another thing. Like sacrifice in Gerard is a lot of like the scapegoat and all that. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong, but Cleo talks well in this. So much of the ritual, what are you doing with the Eucharist? Hey, look at this. You see this? You know it's bread? Actually, in Catholicism, it's the body of Christ. Doesn't look like it. Yeah, look at it with a different horizon. The Eucharist, for example, screams at you that logos and eros is not enough. Look at this. And you're like, that's stupid. It's like, yeah. So that precise participation in something that screams at you, your horizon is wrong, as a constant reminder, at least increases the probability of horizontal being. But this is the point. And I really should go. My kids are going to kill me. Like the religious ritual is not merely a reaffirmation of metaphysical dogmas. It's a habitus of horizontal being. And when you lose it, you lose the practices that increase the probability of horizontal being. And then religion didn't help itself when it was captured by the logic of logos, per se, and the logic of eros. And then it became about metaphysical positions. Do you believe the right things? Do you have the right beliefs? Do you have the right religion? And it lost sight of itself, in my opinion, in its activity as a habitus, to use that Pierre Bourdieu, like a habitus of horizontal being. And so then it's like, well, what's the point of this, right? Are the metaphysical premises true or not? They're false. Well, then I guess I won't go, right? Like, it's stupid, right? Well, yeah, according to logos and eros, but if it's actually primarily something to do with a habitus of horizontal being, that's a different question. And then if you go through history and you see how it's a goose that makes the world what it is, you might actually take silly things a little more seriously, because otherwise we end up in Nash equilibria. So to gooses, to gooses, to gooses.
To gooses.
To gooses. Well, great. Owen, your book's awesome. Any last words? I'll say last words and we'll talk another 30 minutes. Your book is awesome. Everyone go buy this book. It's beautiful. Owen, you wrote a great book. Thank you for being here. Any last words, sir?
No, I was just thinking about just that Aristotle's idea of wonder. Thinking starts at wonder, and I think that's a good description, because you're saying that it is the imagination which maybe comes first. And that's what we forget, and the whole history of that imagination has not been written, and I think we've forgotten about it. So I'll end it there. I won't say any more than that, but I think that's a good way to put it. And the extent to which that sort of interplays, that imagination interplays with this sort of Platonic triad of the soul, I think is important too, because I do think in the classical thinkers that you have this sense of wonder and this sense of imagination, which seems to be always with, if not even before, the sort of what we like to say, oh, it was rational civilization, it was so smart, blah 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 blah. There was something beneath that, which then flourished above this. So I really agree with this, and that forces us to encounter a new, to think of religion in a different way as well, because we have this dogmatic like intelligence, rationality, religion, superstition, and that's it's a very stupid paradigm to begin with. But I mean, like, that's, if you think this way, that goes out the window. So yeah. But anyway, no, thank you for having me on and letting me explain some of this crazy stuff to your people. And maybe we can send a copy to Elon Musk and see what he thinks.
We'll see what he does. He'll be like, oh my gosh, I need to go climb a mountain. I'll try to go to Mars. They're like, that's right, Musk. Don't do them technical. Like, you need a horizontal being. You'd be like, oh my gosh, my life's a lot. Well, I mean, beautifully put. I think we don't need a rational civilization. We need an orbiting civilization that is orbiting something that is always outside the rational calculus that we experience with wonder, that structures our eros and rationality, but is always more like a mountain that is summoning us to possibly climb than a technical problem we can overcome. And what this would all mean, that I just do think is really important, is that imagination and thymos go together. And I don't think we tend to think that. I think we put imagination over in kind of the eros realm, where it's desire. You imagine yourself with the career or the object of the new car, right? Imagination, when it's at its fullest as social imagination, is thymotic. And if you don't have thymos, because social imagination puts a demand on you. Like, oh, okay, you going to do that or not? You're imagining crossing the sea? Well, then you better learn how to do a boat. You better learn how to go out west. Like, social imagination is not fantasy. It can only be realized through the thymotic. And so an age that doesn't have thymos will not actually have imagination. It will have a lot of fantasies, but it will not have imagination. And without imagination, then we lose, well, capital, technology becomes problematic, and you have a climate change problem, right? Because imagination is fundamental, but imagination is thymotic. Fantasy is eros, and hypothetical is logos, but imagination is thymotic. And if we want to regain the human imagination and imagine a different world that is more human, then it will require the thymotic. So thank you for your book, Owen. It's doing a great work. Thank you, sir. All the best.